The old school building of Ku Academy sat quiet under a bruised evening sky, and Issei Hyoudou wondered, not for the first time, why every strange thing that ever happened to him began with him standing in a courtyard about to get hit by something enormous. This time it was a stray devil that had crawled up out of a collapsed shrine on the edge of town, a thing shaped like a spider fused with rusted machinery, all of it wrapped in a smell of scorched oil. Rias stood a few paces ahead of him with her arms folded, red hair catching the last orange light, watching the creature with the calm of someone who had done this 100 times before. "Stay behind Kiba until I give the order," she said. "I can handle it," Issei said, though the gauntlet on his left arm had only just finished forming, green scales gleaming, a single red jewel set in the back of his hand like an eye that had not yet opened. "Boost," said the voice inside it, low and rough, like gravel dragged across stone. "Partner, something feels wrong tonight. I cannot place it." Issei did not have time to ask what drag meant, because the stray devil shrieked and lunged, and the fight began in earnest. Kiba met it first, his sword a blur of silver, cutting a line down one of its many legs before rolling clear. Akeno raised a hand and lightning cracked from a clear sky, striking the creature's back and sending up a spray of black ichor. Kaneko darted in low and put a fist through one of its joints hard enough that the whole leg buckled. It was, by the standards of the peerage, a routine kill. Then the stray devil screamed a second time, and its body split open along a seam none of them had seen, revealing a second, smaller creature curled inside it, pale and eyeless, radiating a cold that made even Rias take a step back. "That is not normal stray devil physiology," Rias said, voice sharpening. "Everyone, fall back, I need to assess this." The pale thing inside the husk turned toward Issei. Only toward Issei. And in a voice like wind through a cave, it spoke a single word: "Emperor." The gauntlet on Issei's arm flared white-hot, and for one instant the world tilted sideways. He felt Drang recoil inside the sacred gear, a sensation like a great weight flinching away from a flame, and then something older than Drang's voice rose up beneath it, something that did not speak so much as press itself directly into the back of Issei's skull. Not a boost. Not a transfer. A recognition. As if a door that had been welded shut for centuries had, for half a second, come unstuck at the hinges. The green scales of the boosted gear darkened at the knuckles, and along the back of Issei's hand, beneath the familiar red jewel, a second mark bloomed into being, gold lines curling outward in a pattern like a crown seen from directly above. It lasted only a moment. Then it was gone, and the gauntlet was simply the gauntlet again, and the pale creature in front of him crumbled into ash as if the mere act of speaking had been the last of its strength. Issei stood there breathing hard, staring at his own hand. "Issei." Rias was suddenly beside him, gripping his wrist, turning the gauntlet this way and that as if she could still see the gold light if she looked hard enough. "What was that?" "I don't know," Issei said honestly. "Drag, what was that?" The Welsh dragon did not answer right away, and when he did, his voice was quieter than Issei had ever heard it. "Partner. We need to speak. Somewhere private. Tonight." Rias's eyes narrowed, but she did not press further in front of the others. She simply nodded once, sharp and decisive, the way she did when she had already made a decision and was only waiting for the right moment to announce it. "Everyone to the clubroom," she said. Now, the walk back across the darkening campus felt longer than usual. Akeno fell into step beside Issei, her expression thoughtful rather than teasing for once, violet eyes flicking to his gauntlet every few seconds as though she expected the gold pattern to reappear. "That symbol," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "I have seen something like it before. In my grandfather's old shrine records. I did not think it was real." "You know what it means?" Issei asked, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. Akeno's smile was faint, almost sad. "I know what it is called, at least. But I would rather not say until I am certain. Some names are dangerous to speak before you understand what answers them." They reached the old school building in silence after that, Issei's mind spinning through every possibility and landing on none of them. Whatever the pale creature had meant by that single word, whatever the gold crown mark on his hand had been, one thing was clear even to him. This was not going to be a normal night, and somewhere far away, in a place that had not stirred in centuries, something old opened one eye and began, very slowly, to remember a name it had almost forgotten how to answer to. The Occult Research Club room felt smaller than usual with all 6 of them crowded around the low table, the summoning circle on the floor glowing faintly beneath their feet as if it too were listening. Start from the beginning, Rias said, seated in her usual chair with her hands folded, though the tightness around her eyes betrayed how little patience she had for waiting. Drake. Whatever you told Issei on the way here, tell all of us. Issei looked down at his hand. The gauntlet had retracted, leaving only bare skin, but he could still feel a faint warmth where the gold mark had been, like a bruise that had not quite finished healing. Very well, Drake said, and his voice carried through the room this time, not just to Issei but to everyone present, a low rumble that made the windows tremble slightly. I had hoped never to have this conversation again in this lifetime, but the world does not care what an old dragon hopes. What is going on with him? Rias's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Long before Albion and I fought over the boosted gear and the dividing, Drake said, before either of us were called heavenly dragons, there was a throne above both our bloodlines. A single dragon who did not choose sides in the wars of gods and devils and fallen, who instead stood above all 3, and was recognized by every dragon race on the earth and beneath it as sovereign. History remembers 100 fragments of that dragon under 100 names. Some call it the First Flame. Some call it the Coiled Crown. The oldest and truest name, the one only dragons still whisper, is the Last Dragon Emperor. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the summoning circle. And you're saying Issei is somehow connected to this, Kiba said slowly. I am saying more than connected, Drake said. When I was sealed into the boosted gear, long after that throne had fallen silent, a single fragment of its bloodline was woven into the gauntlet alongside me, dormant, meant to remain dormant forever. I did not know this myself until tonight, when that creature spoke and the fragment answered. I have carried a sleeping king inside my own prison for 1,000 years and never known it. Issei felt his mouth go dry. So what does that make me? Am I still just your host or? You are still my partner, Drake said, and for the first time there was something almost gentle in the enormous voice. That has not changed and will not change. But it seems the world intends to test whether you can also carry a crown that was never meant to be worn by a human boy from Ku. Akeno leaned forward, hands folded in her lap. The gold crown pattern. I have seen a fragment of it before, carved into a stone lantern at my family's shrine. One my grandmother told me was older than the shrine itself, older than the town. She called it a ward against something she refused to name. I always assumed it was superstition. She looked at Issei with an expression he could not quite read, something between wariness and fascination. It appears I owe my grandmother an apology. So people know about this, Rias said. Which means other people will find out about tonight. That is my concern as well, Drake said. A stray devil husk carrying a herald creature that could sense a dormant fragment of the Dragon Emperor bloodline did not appear by accident. Something drew it here. And if one herald found its way to Issei, others will follow, some far less fragile than the one that crumbled to ash in the courtyard. Rias closed her eyes for a long moment, the weight of command settling visibly over her shoulders. When she opened them again, her voice was calm, decisive, the voice of a young devil determined to protect what was hers. Then we prepare. Akeno, I want everything you can find from your family's records, tomorrow if possible. Kiba, Kaneko, increase training, both of you. I want the period sharper than it has been in months. Issei. She turned to him, and something in her expression softened even as her words stayed firm. You are not facing this alone. Whatever is coming, whatever this throne turns out to mean, you are still mine, and I protect what is mine. Issei felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with fear. Thanks, Bucho. Akeno's eyes flicked between the two of them, and her smile returned, though there was a new weight behind it now, something calculating and warm at once. It seems our Issei is going to be very popular soon. Kings, priestesses, and who knows what else, all drawn to a single dragon boy. How exciting. That's not funny, Akeno, Issei said, though even he could hear how unconvincing he sounded. I never said it was a joke, she said, and the look she gave him made his stomach do something complicated. Outside, the night had gone fully dark, and somewhere beyond the edge of Ko, unseen by any of them, the first of several old and patient eyes had already turned toward the town, drawn by a single flare of gold light that had rippled far further across the world than any of them yet understood. Azazel arrived the next morning without warning, which was, Rias had long since learned, simply how Azazel operated. He leaned against the clubroom window with his usual lazy grin, sunglasses pushed up into his hair, looking for all the world like a man who had wandered in off the street rather than the Governor-General of the fallen angels. So, he said, I hear my favorite security grew a crown last night. How do you already know that? Rias said flatly. I have my sources. Also Drake complained to me telepathically at 3 in the morning, which, frankly, rude, some of us sleep. Azazel's grin faded into something more serious as he pushed off the window and crossed to stand in front of Issei, studying him the way a scientist studies an interesting specimen, which, Issei reflected, was probably exactly what was happening. Show me the mark. Issei summoned the gauntlet, and after a moment of concentration that felt like reaching for a memory just out of reach, the gold crown pattern flickered faintly along the back of his hand, fainter than the night before but unmistakably present. Azazel whistled low. Well, that is not something I expected to see in my lifetime, and I have had a very long lifetime. You know what it is, Rias said. I know the stories, same as most of the old factions. The last Dragon Emperor is one of those legends every faction tells a slightly different version of, usually as a cautionary tale about what happens when power gets too big to belong to any one side. Gods, devils, fallen, even the old dragon kings themselves, all of them eventually decided a throne above all three was too dangerous to exist, so between them they broke it apart, and scattered the pieces so far and so thin that nobody could ever gather them again. He tapped his chin. Apparently somebody did not scatter carefully enough. Drake's voice rumbled from the gauntlet. It seems a fragment was sealed with me without my knowledge, at the time of my own imprisonment. I would guess the original architects of that seal wanted a fragment kept somewhere unreachable. A weapon locked inside a weapon, buried inside a war none of them expected to end quickly. And now it's waking up, Issei said. Now it's waking up, Azazel agreed, because whatever drew that herald creature here last night has found where one piece of the puzzle is hiding, and I would bet good money it is not the only piece still out there. He looked at Rias. Which means, Gremory, you have got a decision to make. Word travels fast in old circles. If even a rumor of Issei being connected to the Dragon Emperor bloodline gets out, you are going to have every faction on Earth sending someone to Ko to investigate, and some of them will not be as polite as I am being right now. Rias's jaw tightened. Then we control the information. Nobody outside this room and my brother's inner circle. Wise, but probably not enough, Azazel said. Some of these old bloodlines have their own ways of sensing a fragment stirring, no rumors required. You felt that flare of power reach beyond Ko last night, didn't you, Drake? Farther than I would like, Drake admitted grimly. Azazel spread his hands as if that settled the matter. So, my professional recommendation, since I am apparently your unpaid consultant on ancient dragon politics now, is that you stop thinking about how to hide this and start thinking about how to survive it. Because hiding it is not going to work for long. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken finally by Akeno, who had been quiet in the corner throughout the exchange, arms crossed, expression thoughtful. There may be another option, she said. My grandmother's shrine keeps records that predate most of what the factions remember, records from a time before the modern lines were drawn so cleanly. If there is any information on how the original seal was constructed, or who might still remember the details, it would be there. I could go this weekend. You would go alone? Rias asked, concern flickering across her face. I would not be alone, Akeno said, and her gaze slid sideways to Issei with a small, private smile. I think it is past time our Dragon Emperor learned a little about the shrine that has apparently been keeping watch over him since before he was born. Issei blinked. Wait, me? I don't even know anything about shrines. I'll probably break something. Then it is fortunate I will be there to stop you, Akeno said sweetly, and something about the warmth in her voice made the coming weekend feel a great deal less frightening than the conversation happening around it. Azazel clapped his hands together, grin returning in full force. Excellent, a field trip. While the two of you go dig through dusty shrine scrolls, I will make some calls, see if I can figure out exactly who or what sent that herald and how much time we actually have before this gets complicated. He paused at the door, glancing back with an expression that, for once, held no humor at all. For what it's worth, kid, whatever you turn out to be underneath all this, you are still the idiot who threw himself in front of a stray devil to protect his friends last spring. That matters more than any old crown. Try to remember that when things get strange. He was gone in a flutter of black feathers before anyone could reply, leaving the clubroom quieter than before, and Issei alone with the uncomfortable feeling that his life, already strange by any ordinary measure, was about to become considerably stranger still. The Himejima shrine sat at the top of a long stone staircase on the far edge of town, surrounded by cedar trees so old their trunks were wider than Issei was tall. He counted the steps out of nervous habit and lost count somewhere past 200, arriving at the top slightly out of breath while Akeno, walking beside him in a simple kimono instead of her school uniform, seemed entirely unaffected. You climb this every time you visit? He asked. Every time, she said, amused. It builds character. Also thighs, though I doubt you were asking about that. Issei made a strangled noise that Akeno pretended not to notice, and they continued through the shrine gate into a courtyard swept so clean it looked untouched by wind or weather. An old woman waited near the main hall, silver hair pulled into a tight bun, watching their approach with sharp eyes that reminded Issei uncomfortably of Akeno's own gaze when she was deciding how much to tease him. Grandmother, Akeno said, bowing formally. This is Issei Hyoudou. I explained the situation in my message. The old woman studied Issei for a long moment, long enough that he fought the urge to fidget, before she gave a small, satisfied nod, as though he had passed some test he had not known he was taking. So the stone finally answered, she said. I did not think I would live to see it. She turned and led them into the main hall without further explanation, moving with a brisk efficiency that suggested she had already decided exactly what needed to happen and saw no reason to waste time discussing it. The hall inside was dim and smelled of old wood and incense, shelves lined with scrolls and boxes that looked as though they had not been disturbed in decades. Akeno's grandmother knelt before one shelf and drew out a long wooden box, setting it on the low table between them with a reverence that made even Issei hold his breath. This shrine has kept watch over a single seal since before my grandmother's grandmother tended these grounds, she said, opening the box to reveal a flat stone tablet inside, etched with a pattern Issei recognized immediately, the same gold crown lines that had appeared on the back of his hand. We were never told what it guarded, only that it must never be disturbed, and that if it ever answered, we were to help whoever it answered to, without question or hesitation. You've been guarding this for generations, Akeno said quietly, and you never knew what it was? Some duties are older than understanding, her grandmother said simply. That does not make them less important. She looked at Issei, and her sharp eyes softened slightly. Give me your hand, boy. Issei extended his hand without hesitation, some instinct telling him this was not a moment to argue. The old woman pressed his palm flat against the stone tablet, and the moment skin met stone, the gold crown pattern flared to life across both surfaces at once, lines connecting between his hand and the tablet like threads being drawn taut. Drake's voice rumbled with something close to awe. I can feel it. This is not a herald or a fragment drawn from elsewhere, partner. This is a piece of the original seal itself, kept whole and untouched for 1,000 years. The light faded after a few seconds, leaving Issei's hand tingling and the gold crown mark noticeably brighter than it had been before, no longer flickering in and out but holding steady, like a lamp that had finally caught properly. What just happened? Issei asked, flexing his fingers. The stone recognized its own bloodline, Akeno's grandmother said, closing the box with a satisfaction that looked almost like relief, as if she had been waiting her entire life to set down a burden. This shrine's purpose is complete. Whatever comes next is no longer something my family alone can protect. Akeno knelt beside the table, studying the empty space where the tablet's light had faded, her expression troubled. Grandmother, if the seal was built from multiple pieces kept in different places, this cannot be the only one. There must be others, hidden the same way, waiting the same way. Undoubtedly, her grandmother said. And now that one piece has answered, the others will feel it too, the same way that herald creature felt it days ago. Whoever holds the remaining fragments, whatever remains of the old orders who scattered them in the first place, they will all know that the last dragon emperor bloodline has begun to wake. Issei felt the weight of that settle over him slowly, the way cold water soaks through cloth. It was one thing to hear Drake and Azazel discuss ancient legends in the abstract safety of the clubroom. It was another to kneel in a shrine that had guarded a piece of his own bloodline for 1,000 years and feel, for the first time, that whatever this crown turned out to mean, it was already far bigger than he was. Akeno, he said quietly, am I in over my head here? She was silent for a moment, looking at him with an expression that held none of her usual teasing warmth, only something steadier and more honest. Probably, she admitted. But you have never let that stop you before. And this time you will not be facing it alone. I intend to make certain of that personally. Her grandmother watched the exchange with a small, knowing smile that neither of them noticed, already reaching for a second scroll, and a third, laying the beginnings of a long night of research on the table between them, the first thread in what would become a much larger search for a crown broken into pieces and scattered across a world that had, until a few days ago, believed it would never be whole again. Word of the shrine tablet reached Rias before Issei and Akeno had even made it back down the long stone staircase, carried by a hurried message circle that Rias had set up the moment they left. By the time the two of them returned to the clubroom, the atmosphere inside had shifted from cautious concern to something closer to a war council. Maps and old texts spread across the low table, Rias pacing near the window with her phone pressed to her ear. Understood. Thank you, Sona. She ended the call and turned to face Issei and Akeno as they entered, relief plain on her face at the sight of them both unharmed. Sona's put a discreet watch on the town borders, in case anything else tries to slip in the way that Harold did. How did it go? Better and worse than expected, Akeno said, setting a folder of copied notes on the table. There is at least one more fragment confirmed to exist, possibly several. My family's tablet was only ever meant to hold and recognize a single piece, not gather the rest. Kiba, seated cross-legged near the table with a stack of his own research, looked up with interest. Any leads on where the others might be? A few old references, Akeno said, though my grandmother's records are centuries out of date on some of it. One mentions a fragment entrusted to a Nekishu clan, of all things, as a gesture of peace between dragonkind and the yokai factions a long time ago. Whether that fragment, or that clan even still exists is another question entirely. Kaneko, who had been quietly sharpening a training blade in the corner, went very still. Everyone turned to look at her. Kaneko? Rias asked gently. Nekishu, Kaneko repeated, voice flat in the way it went when she was working very hard to keep it flat. There aren't many of us left. If there's a clan holding something like that, it's mine or it isn't anyone's. You've never mentioned anything like this, Rias said carefully. Because I don't know anything about it, Kaneko said, setting the blade down with more force than necessary. I was young when I left. There's a lot about the clan I don't know. There's a lot I don't want to know. Her gaze flicked, briefly and involuntarily, toward the window, toward the wider world beyond Ko where an older sister she rarely spoke of was still, as far as any of them knew, wandering somewhere out there with a reputation Kaneko had spent years trying to distance herself from. Akeno noticed the look and softened her voice. Kaneko, if this fragment does exist within your clan's old holdings, you would know more about where to even begin looking than any record in my grandmother's shrine. I am not asking you to go looking for anyone in particular. Only that if a lead comes up, you would not be starting from nothing. Kaneko was quiet for a long moment, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Finally she exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, though not all of it. If it comes to that, I'll help. But I'm not going looking for her. Not for this. Not for anything. Issei, watching the exchange with a growing unease he did not fully understand, opened his mouth to ask who her was, and thought better of it at the last second, some instinct telling him this was not the moment. Rias redirected the conversation smoothly, the way she always did when a room needed steering away from a rawer subject. For now, our priority stays the same. Protect Issei, gather what information we safely can, and keep the peerage together while we figure out how large this actually is. She looked around the room, meeting each of their eyes in turn. This is bigger than any of us expected a week ago. That does not change what we do. It only means we do it more carefully. The meeting broke up not long after, the others drifting off toward homework and evening chores with the particular exhaustion of people who had been handed a great deal more to think about than usual. Issei lingered in the clubroom after most of the others had gone, staring out the same window Azazel had leaned against days before, turning the day's revelations over in his mind. A crown. A bloodline. A fragment guarded for 1,000 years inside a stone tablet, and possibly another hidden somewhere within a clan of vanishing cat spirits, connected, however distantly, to a girl he considered a friend and a sister she never spoke of. Drake, he said silently. You've been alive a long time. Does any of this scare you? The Welsh dragon was quiet for a moment before answering, his voice carrying none of its usual bravado. Old things scare me more than young ones, partner. A young enemy can still surprise itself into mercy. An old one has usually had all the mercy worn out of it centuries ago. Whatever set that herald loose upon you, whatever else comes looking for the pieces of this crown, I do not think it will be young. Issei let that settle over him in the quiet clubroom, the last of the evening light fading through the window, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he was not as afraid as he probably should have been. Whatever was coming, he was not facing it with an empty gauntlet and a handful of friends who barely understood what they were dealing with. He was facing it with Rias's steady command, Akeno's quiet steel, Kaniko's stubborn loyalty even in the face of old wounds, and Drake's 1,000 years of hard-won wisdom, all of it standing between him and whatever old, mercy-worn thing was even now beginning to stir at the news that a fragment of the Dragon Emperor's crown had finally answered. It would have to be enough. He intended to make sure it was. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended calm, the kind that Issei had learned over the past year to distrust on principle. Classes continued as normal. Matsuda and Motohama complained about their usual grievances, blissfully unaware of anything unusual happening around them, and for a few hours each day Issei was almost able to pretend his life was ordinary again. It ended on a Thursday evening, in the middle of peerage training in the clubroom's basement practice space, when the temperature in the room dropped without warning and every light in the building flickered at once. Rias was on her feet instantly, a crimson glow gathering around her hands. Everyone, formation. Now. The air in the center of the room split apart like paper tearing, and through the gap stepped a figure unlike anything Issei had encountered before, tall and gaunt, wrapped in robes the color of old rust, its face hidden beneath a hood from which 2 points of pale light gleamed where eyes should have been. It did not radiate the chaotic, animal menace of the stray devil days earlier. It radiated something colder, older, and far more deliberate, the presence of something that had done this exact thing many times across many centuries and had never once failed. Security, it said, voice dry as old parchment. The crown has answered. We felt it 3 nights past, and we have come to see whether the vessel is worthy or merely convenient. Who are you? Rias demanded, stepping in front of Issei without hesitation. A warden, the figure said, as if the title explained everything. One of those who scattered the crown 1,000 years ago, so that no single hand could ever again hold power above gods, devils, and fallen alike. We did not scatter it so carelessly that we would fail to notice its pieces waking. The pale points of light beneath the hood fixed on Issei. Show me the mark, boy, or step aside and let your king answer for you. Issei felt Drake stir inside the gauntlet, a low warning growl beneath the surface of his thoughts. Careful, partner. This one is not young. I'm not stepping aside, Issei said, moving up beside Rias rather than behind her, and summoned the boosted gear in a flare of green light. The gold crown pattern rose along the back of his hand almost immediately this time, steadier than it had ever been, as though the days since the shrine had given it time to settle properly into his skin. The warden studied the mark for a long moment, utterly still, and then, unexpectedly, inclined its hooded head in something that might have been respect. The bloodline recognizes you. That is more than most who have carried a false claim to that crown across the centuries could ever manage. A pause. It does not mean you are ready. It does not mean the other fragments will yield so easily, nor that the ones who still wish the crown to remain broken will simply allow you to gather them in peace. Then tell us who does wish that, Rias said sharply. If you already know we're gathering fragments, tell us who we're up against. That is not information I am permitted to give freely, the warden said. But I will give you this much, as a courtesy owed to a bloodline that answered honestly rather than by force or theft. There are 3 fragments remaining beyond the one this shrine kept and the one now stirring within the boy's own gauntlet. One rests among the yokai, guarded by a clan that has nearly forgotten what it protects. One rests in a place neither devil nor angel nor fallen can easily reach. And one. The pale lights flickered, something like reluctance passing through the ancient voice. One is no longer where it was left. It was taken, some decades past, by hands that should never have found it, and if that fragment answers before the rest of the crown is gathered and stabilized in a worthy vessel, the consequences will not be contained to this small town. A heavy silence fell over the practice room. What happens if an unworthy vessel gathers all the pieces? Kiba asked quietly. The same thing that happened the last time it nearly occurred, the warden said. A war that very nearly ended every faction on this earth at once. That is why we scattered it in the first place, and why we have watched every generation since, waiting to see whether it would ever wake again, and praying, in whatever manner things like myself are capable of prayer, that it would not. It turned back to Issei, pale lights dimming slightly. You have days, perhaps weeks, before the fragment that was stolen finds its way into hands that intend to use it. I would advise you to move quickly, and to choose your allies carefully. Not everyone drawn by a crown's awakening comes seeking to protect it. Without further explanation, the tear in the air widened once more, and the warden stepped backward through it, the gap ceiling shut behind it as though it had never been there at all, leaving the practice room cold and silent, and considerably more frightened than it had been 5 minutes earlier. Rias let out a slow breath, the crimson glow around her hands fading as she turned to face her peerage. Well, now we know the shape of what we're dealing with. A stolen fragment in the hands of people who already know how dangerous it is, Akeno said, arms crossed, expression grim. That is not a comforting shape, Bucho. No, Rias agreed. It isn't. She looked at Issei, and beneath the worry in her eyes there was something fiercer, something that looked very much like resolve hardening into a decision already made. But we are not letting anyone use a piece of you against the rest of the world. Whatever it takes, we find the fragments first, starting with the one closest to home. Kaneko, who had gone very still and quiet the moment the warden mentioned the yokai clan, finally spoke, voice low but steady. I said I wouldn't go looking for her. I meant it. A pause, her small hands curling into fists at her sides. But if the fragment really is with the clan, and if someone dangerous is already hunting the other pieces, then I'm not going to be the reason we lose the trail because I was too stubborn to ask the one person who might actually know where to start. Issei felt something tighten in his chest at the quiet weight in her voice, the effort it clearly cost her to say those words out loud. Kaneko, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said, cutting him off, though not unkindly. I'm choosing to. There's a difference. She looked up at him, and for just a moment the mask of blank composure slipped, revealing something younger and more uncertain underneath. Besides, if it really is her holding that fragment, somebody's going to have to explain to her why a dragon boy from Ko Academy is suddenly the most important person in the world. Might as well be me. Rias placed a hand gently on Kaneko's shoulder. We do this together. All of us. Nobody goes looking for anyone alone. Her gaze swept the room, settling last on Issei with a warmth that steadied him more than he expected. A crown broken into pieces, a thief who already knows what they're holding, and days, maybe weeks, before it becomes a crisis too large to contain. That is what we are facing. She straightened, shoulders squared, every inch the young devil determined to protect what was hers. So we had better get started. Outside the old school building, the night had gone fully still, the kind of stillness that settles over a town in the moments before a storm finally breaks, and far beyond the edge of Ko, in places none of them could yet see, 3 fragments of a broken crown waited in the dark, one guarded by a fading clan, one hidden where no ordinary hand could reach, and one already moving through hands that had no intention of letting it rest quietly ever again. Kuroka arrived the way she always seemed to, without warning, without any of the usual signs the devil household relied on to detect an intruder, simply appearing one afternoon seated on the low wall outside the old school building as though she had been there for hours and everyone else was late to notice her. Issei spotted her first on his way back from class and nearly dropped his bag. "You," he said, pointing, because his brain had not yet caught up enough to manage a full sentence. "Me," Kuroka agreed cheerfully, swinging her legs where she sat, cat ears twitching atop her head, tail curling lazily behind her. "Nya, and here I thought a dragon boy carrying a piece of the old crown around inside him would be a little more composed than this." "How do you already know about that?" Issei managed. "Sweetheart, half of yokai country felt that little flare of gold light 3 nights ago. It rippled through every senjutsu-sensitive bloodline west of the mountains. You might as well have lit a signal fire." She hopped down from the wall, landing lightly, and studied him with open, unhurried curiosity, gold eyes flicking briefly to the hand where the gauntlet usually formed. "So, the last Dragon Emperor, all grown up in a Ko Academy uniform. Life really does love its little jokes." The clubroom door banged open behind them, and Kaneko stepped out onto the walkway, having clearly sensed her sister's presence the moment it arrived. She stopped dead at the sight of Kuroka, expression shuddering closed so fast it was almost visible, the careful blankness she wore whenever the subject of her past came anywhere near the surface. "Chiron," Kuroka said softly, and for just a moment the teasing lightness dropped out of her voice entirely, replaced by something raw and uncertain that looked almost painfully out of place on her usually confident features. "You've gotten taller." "Don't call me that," Kaneko said, voice flat, though her hands had curled into fists at her sides. "I go by Kaneko now." "You know that." "I know," Kuroka said, and there was an old, familiar ache in the words, the sound of an argument that had been had many times before and never once resolved. She did not push further, simply held her sister's gaze for a long moment before turning back to Issei with a visible, deliberate effort to lighten the mood again, though something in her shoulders stayed tense. "Anyway, I did not come all this way just to make my little sister glare at me, tempting as that always is. I came because the clan I grew up in is still sitting on a fragment of your crown, Dragon Boy, and word is starting to travel through yokai circles that it might not stay hidden much longer." Rias appeared in the doorway behind Kaneko, having clearly been listening from just inside. "Word from who?" Kuroka's playful expression sharpened into something far more serious. "From people who should not know about it yet, which is exactly why I decided showing up in person was faster than sending a letter you'd probably ignore anyway." She looked between Rias and Issei, tail flicking with restless energy. "There's a faction of old yokai purists who never forgave the peace agreement my clan's elders made a long time ago, the one that put a fragment of the crown in Nekasha hands as a gesture of goodwill toward dragonkind. They've been quiet for decades because there was nothing to gain from stirring up an old grudge. Now that the crown is waking, that fragment just became the most valuable thing in yokai country, and purists aren't exactly known for asking nicely." "You're saying they might try to take it," Rias said. "I'm saying they're already moving toward the clan's old holdings," Kuroka said. "Which is a problem, because the clan itself is scattered and half forgotten these days, mostly old caretakers and a handful of elders who wouldn't know how to defend a teacup, let alone a crown fragment that could restart a war nobody living remembers how to survive." Her gaze slid, briefly and pointedly, to Kaneko. "Which is why, much as I know you'd rather never see my face again, little sister, I'm going to need your help getting there before the purists do." Kaneko's jaw tightened, old wounds flickering visibly behind her eyes, memories of a clan and a sister she had spent years trying to leave behind for reasons Issei still did not fully understand. For a long moment nobody spoke, the tension in the small courtyard thick enough to taste. "I already said I'd help find the fragment," Kaneko said finally, voice low. "That doesn't mean I forgive you. It doesn't mean anything's different between us." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Kuroka said quietly, and for once there was no teasing in her voice at all, only something tired and sincere. I'm asking you to help me protect the last piece of home either of us has left, before someone burns it down to spite a peace treaty older than both of us. That's all. Whatever's broken between us can stay broken a while longer, if it has to. Kaneko studied her sister's face for a long, silent moment, searching for something Issei couldn't name, before finally giving a single, sharp nod. Fine. For the clan. Not for you. I'll take it, Kuroka said, and the smallest, most genuine smile Issei had seen from her yet flickered across her face before vanishing back beneath her usual playful mask. Rias stepped forward, taking command of the moment with the ease of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Then we move as a group. Kuroka, if you're willing to guide us, and Kaneko, if you're willing to go, then the rest of the peerage comes as well. We are not sending two people alone into a territory dispute with an armed purist faction, not when a piece of Issei's bloodline is on the line. Kuroka arched an eyebrow at her, clearly reassessing the young devil in front of her with fresh interest. You're braver than most crimson-haired devil heiresses I've met, offering to march your whole peerage into yokai territory on my word alone. I'm not doing it on your word alone, Rias said evenly. I'm doing it because Issei trusts Kaneko, and Kaneko is choosing to trust you, at least for now. That's enough for me to act on. Her gaze swept the small gathered group, Issei, Akeno now standing quietly in the doorway, Kaneko rigid but resolved, Kuroka watching them all with an expression that had gone, for just a moment, genuinely moved. We leave for the clan's territory tomorrow. Everyone rest tonight. Whatever's waiting for us there, I intend for all of us to come back from it together. That evening, the clubroom held a quieter kind of gathering than the tense war councils of the past few days. The whole peerage settled into the low chairs and cushions with tea Akeno had brewed, going over what little they knew about the purist faction and the layout of the clan's old territory from a set of maps Kuroka had sketched from memory. The main holdings sit in a valley about half a day's travel north of here, if we cross through the usual routes, Kuroka explained, tracing a line across the rough map with one claw-tipped finger. There's an old shrine at the center that most of the elders still tend, though there aren't many of them left these days. The fragment should be kept somewhere in the shrine's inner sanctum, probably sealed the same slow, patient way your girlfriend's shrine kept its own peace. She glanced sideways at Akeno with open curiosity. Speaking of which, I'd love to hear how that went, Dragon Boy, since apparently you've already got one priestess wrapped around your finger. I am not wrapped around anything, Akeno said serenely, pouring more tea with perfect composure, though the faint pink at the tips of her ears told a slightly different story. Though I will admit our trip to the shrine was educational in more ways than one. Issei, who had gone red the moment Kuroka mentioned girlfriend, opened his mouth to protest and found no actual words willing to cooperate, which only made Kuroka's grin widen further. Careful, little sister, Kuroka said, glancing at Kaneko, your king's about to short-circuit. He does that, Kaneko said deadpan, not looking up from her own cup, though the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth suggested she was, in her own quiet way, enjoying Issei's discomfort as much as her sister was. Rias cleared her throat, steering the conversation back on course with the ease of long practice. Once we're inside the valley, our priority is reaching the shrine and securing the fragment before the purist faction can. Kuroka, how many of them are we likely to be dealing with? Hard to say exactly, Kuroka admitted, sobering. The core group that never accepted the peace treaty was small, maybe a dozen serious fighters at its worst, but they've had decades to recruit sympathizers among younger yokai who never lived through the war and only hear the purest version of why it happened. Could be a handful. Could be considerably more, if they'd been building toward this moment for a while. Then we go in prepared for considerably more, Rias said. Kiba, you'll take point on the approach. Your speed will matter most if we need to move quickly through unfamiliar terrain. Akeno, aerial support and any barriers the shrine's old defenses might still recognize as friendly. Kaneko, you know this land better than any of us, even after all this time, so I want your instincts leading us once we're actually inside the valley. Issei. Her gaze settled on him, steady and certain. You are the reason any of this matters to the people trying to take that fragment. Which means you are also the reason it matters that we succeed. Stay close to me, and trust your gauntlet. Drake has carried worse odds than this before. Drake's rumble of agreement carried faintly from where the gauntlet rested dormant beneath Issei's sleeve. Worse odds, certainly. Though I will admit, partner, a valley full of purest yokai defending against the Nekashu reunion is a stranger battlefield than most I have fought on. You and me both, Issei muttered, earning a soft laugh from Akeno beside him. Kuroka watched the exchange with an expression that had grown steadily more thoughtful over the course of the evening, gold eyes flicking between Issei, Rias, and Akeno with open, assessing curiosity. You know, she said eventually, when I first felt that flare of gold light 3 nights ago, I expected to find some grim, self-important dragon lord brooding about the terrible weight of destiny. Instead I get a boy who blushes if you call him someone's boyfriend, a devil heiress willing to march her whole peerage into a fight that isn't technically hers, and a priestess who apparently keeps a 1,000-year-old shrine on retainer for emergencies. She shook her head, tail curling with something that looked almost like fondness. Honestly, I think I like this version a lot better. I'll take that as a compliment, Issei said. You should, Kuroka said. I don't hand those out often. She stood, stretching with feline ease, the playful energy returning to her posture even as something more serious lingered underneath it. Get some rest, all of you. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and I have a feeling it's only the first of many before this crown of yours is anywhere close to whole. The meeting broke up not long after, the peerage drifting off in 2s and 3s toward the dormitories, leaving Issei alone in the clubroom for a few quiet minutes as the last of the evening light faded outside the window. Akeno lingered longest, settling into the chair beside him with her own cup of tea, watching him with the same thoughtful warmth she had carried since the moment his hand met the tablet in her family's shrine. You're worried, she said, not a question. A little, Issei admitted. This whole thing keeps getting bigger. A week ago I was just trying to survive stray devil fights without embarrassing myself. Now there's a broken crown, ancient wardens, purist factions, and apparently half of yokai country already knows my name. And yet, Akeno said gently, you have not once suggested stepping back from any of it. Because I can't, Issei said. Not when it means people I care about end up in the middle of it whether I step back or not. Might as well stay and fight it properly. He looked over at her, and something in her steady, patient gaze made the words come easier than he expected. Besides, I've got you. And Bucho. And apparently a very loud dragon who's had 1,000 years to get good advice ready for exactly this kind of situation. That helps more than I probably say enough. Akeno's smile softened into something quieter and more private than her usual teasing warmth, and she reached over to rest her hand lightly over his on the table between them. Then let us make sure you keep saying it, she said. Whatever crown you turn out to carry, Issei, you are not carrying it alone. I intend to make very certain of that. For as long as you will let me. Outside, the last light faded fully from the sky, and somewhere north of Kuo, in a valley half forgotten by the modern world, an old shrine sat quiet under gathering clouds, unaware that the following day would bring the first true test of whether a broken crown could ever truly be made whole again, or whether the old wars that shattered it in the first place were only just beginning to stir back to life. The valley Kuroka led them into the next morning looked, at first glance, like something out of an old painting, terraced hillsides wrapped in mist, cedar forests crowding close on either side of a narrow dirt path, the distant shape of a shrine roof just visible through the haze at the valley's center. It was beautiful in the particular, breath-catching way that made Issei forget for a moment exactly why they had come. The feeling did not last. Something's wrong, Kaneko said, stopping mid-step, ears flattening against her hair. It's too quiet. There should be caretakers on the outer paths by now. Kuroka's playful expression vanished entirely, replaced by a hunter's focus that made her look, suddenly, far older than her usual demeanor suggested. She's right. This time of morning, there's always at least 2 or 3 elders sweeping the approach. She crouched low, gold eyes narrowing as she studied the mist ahead. We're not the first ones here today. Rias's hand tightened around the crimson energy already gathering at her fingertips. Formation. Kiba, scout the path ahead quietly. Everyone else stays close until we know what we're walking into. Kiba vanished in a blur of speed, gone and back again within a handful of seconds, his expression grim when he returned. There's fighting near the shrine. A dozen or more yokai, maybe 15, and I only saw 2 elders trying to hold them off. That's them, Kuroka said, already moving, all playful pretense gone. The purists. They didn't wait. Then neither do we, Rias said, and the peerage surged forward together up the narrow path, mist parting around them as the sounds of battle grew louder ahead, shouts and the sharp crack of spirit energy colliding, the unmistakable chaos of a fight already well underway. They broke through the tree-line into the shrine's outer courtyard to a scene of controlled chaos. 2 elderly Nikomata, fur streaked white with age, standing back to back against a ring of younger yokai in dark traveling clothes, spirit fire crackling between clawed hands on both sides. One of the elders was bleeding from a shallow cut along her arm, the other visibly favoring one leg, both of them holding their ground through sheer stubbornness rather than any remaining strength. That's enough, Kuroka's voice cracked across the courtyard like a whip, and every yokai head in the clearing turned toward her at once, several visibly recoiling at the sight of her. The Nekishu trader, one of the purists, spat, a lean, scarred man with cold eyes fixed on Kuroka like a wolf sighting familiar prey. Come crawling back now that there's something worth stealing, have you? I'm not here to steal anything, Kuroka said, stepping forward with her sister at her side, the 2 of them moving in an unconscious mirror of each other that Issei found, even in the tension of the moment, quietly moving to watch. I'm here to make sure you don't burn down the last thing my clan has left over, a grudge that should have died with the people who started it. The treaty was a betrayal the moment it was signed, the scarred man said. Dragonkind should never have been trusted with a piece of that crown, and neither should the fools who handed it to them. We're only finishing what should have happened decades ago. Rias stepped forward, drawing every eye in the courtyard toward her and, more pointedly, toward Issei standing just behind her shoulder. The crown is already waking, with or without your permission. Attacking an old shrine and a handful of elders will not stop that. It will only add more blood to a story that has already cost enough. The scarred man's gaze slid to Issei, sharpening with sudden, hungry interest. So this is him. The vessel. This is Issei, Rias said, voice hard as stone. And he is under my protection, along with everyone standing in this courtyard who has done nothing but try to protect their own home. For a long, tense moment nobody moved, the standoff stretched taut as a drawn bowstring, mist curling silently around the assembled fighters on both sides. Then the scarred man smiled, thin and cold, and raised one clawed hand. Take the fragment, he said. Kill anyone who stands in the way. The courtyard erupted into motion. Kiba was already moving before the first purist reached him, sword flashing silver as he carved a path toward the 2 wounded elders, putting himself between them and the incoming attackers with practiced ease. Akeno rose into the air with a crack of thunder, lightning arcing down to scatter a knot of yokai attempting to flank from the tree line. Kaneko and Kuroka moved together without needing to discuss it, sister fighting alongside sister for the first time in what was clearly years, senjutsu flaring gold and violet around them in a display that made even the scarred purist leader falter for half a step. Issei summoned the boosted gear in a flash of green light, the gold crown pattern rising steady and bright along the back of his hand, and felt Drake's presence settle firmly alongside his own thoughts, calm despite the chaos. Whatever comes, partner, we face it together. As always, Issei agreed, and threw himself into the fight beside Rias, dodging a slash of claws and driving his gauntlet fist into an attacker's shoulder hard enough to send them tumbling backward into the mist. Around him the courtyard rang with the sounds of battle, spirit fire and steel and thunder, the peerage fighting as one against a threat that had, only a week ago, existed for all of them only as an old and half-forgotten legend. Through the chaos, the scarred purist leader began advancing steadily toward the shrine's inner sanctum, ignoring the fighting around him entirely, focused only on the doorway beyond which, Issei realized with a lurch of dread, the fragment itself must be waiting. Rias, he's heading for the shrine, Issei shouted. Then stop him, Rias called back, already moving to intercept 2 more attackers of her own. I trust you, Issei. Go. Issei broke away from the main fighting, sprinting across the courtyard with the gauntlet's power surging up through his arm, gold light bright enough now to cast long shadows across the mist. The scarred man turned at his approach, cold eyes narrowing with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been contempt. So the vessel finally shows some spine, he said. Let's see if there's anything underneath it worth the fuss everyone's making. He lunged, claws extended, and Issei barely had time to raise the gauntlet before the two of them collided in a shower of green and black light. The fight for the shrine's inner sanctum, and for the next fragment of a crown 1,000 years broken, beginning in earnest at last. The impact sent them both skidding backward, mist scattering in twin arcs, and for a moment neither moved, sizing each other up across the narrow stretch of courtyard that separated them from the sanctum doors. The scarred man's claws had left 3 shallow lines across the back of the gauntlet, sparking faintly where they crossed the gold crown pattern, and Issei felt Drake's growl of anger rumble through his own chest at the sight of it. He is testing the seal, partner, not merely fighting you. Do not let him land another strike near the mark. Wasn't planning on it, Issei muttered, and pushed forward again, boosted strength surging through his arm as he closed the distance in a single stride, gauntlet raised. The scarred man's eyes widened, just slightly, at the speed of the follow-up, barely managing to twist aside as Issei's fist tore through the space where his head had been a heartbeat earlier, splintering one of the old wooden support posts along the sanctum's outer wall. Behind them, the sounds of the wider battle continued unabated, Akeno's thunder rolling across the valley, Kaneko and Kuroka moving as a single fluid unit through the ranks of purist fighters, Kiba's silver blade a constant flashing guard between the elders and any attacker who dared come close. Stubborn, the scarred man hissed, circling warily now, respect and irritation warring openly across his scarred features. Fine. Let's see how stubborn you remain once I've taken what I came for. He surged forward again, faster this time, claws aimed not at Issei directly but at the sanctum doors just behind him, a feint Issei only barely recognized in time to twist his body and block the strike with the flat of the gauntlet instead of his ribs. The force of the blows still drove him back a full step, boots skidding against old stone, and beyond the man's shoulder Issei caught his first real glimpse through the splintered doorway of the sanctum's interior, a small stone altar at the center of the room, and resting atop it, wrapped in faded cloth, something that pulsed faintly with the same gold light now steady along the back of his own hand. The fragment. Right there. Close enough that he could feel it answering the mark on his skin the way the shrine tablet had answered days before, a low and steady hum that seemed to settle directly into his bones. The scarred man saw the recognition dawn on Issei's face and smiled, cold and thin. There it is, he said softly. Now we're both finally looking at the same prize. He raised his claws once more, spirit energy gathering dark and heavy around them, and beyond him, through the mist and chaos of the courtyard, Issei heard Rias's voice cut through the noise, sharp with urgency. Issei, whatever you're about to do it now. Issei planted his feet, gold light flaring brighter along the gauntlet than it had at any point since that first night in the courtyard outside the old school building, and felt Drake's presence rise up fully alongside his own resolve, ancient and certain and utterly unshaken. Then let us show him exactly what a worthy vessel looks like, partner. The two of them, dragon and boy and the sleeping crown between them, surged forward together into the fight for the fragment, the outcome of which neither the scarred purist leader nor anyone else in that mist-shrouded valley could yet begin to guess. The scarred man moved like something that had stopped being fully human a long time ago, claws trailing dark energy as he closed the distance between himself and the sanctum doors, and Issei met him head-on rather than give ground, gauntlet raised, gold light steady along the crown mark on the back of his hand. Their first exchange rattled the old wooden support posts hard enough that dust sifted down from the roof beams. The second sent Issei skidding backward across the courtyard stones, boots carving twin furrows through the mist. He planted his feet before the third blow could land and caught the man's wrist in his gauntlet hand, the impact jarring up through his whole arm. You fight like someone who has something to protect, the scarred man said, straining against the grip, cold eyes narrowed. That will not be enough. It's been enough so far, Issei said, and released the man's wrist only to drive his other fist forward, boosted strength behind it, catching him square across the chest and sending him crashing back through the splintered sanctum doorway in a spray of broken wood. Drake's voice rose steady and certain inside the gauntlet. Now, partner. While he is down. Issei surged forward through the broken doorway into the sanctum itself, the small stone altar, and its cloth-wrapped bundle glowing brighter with every step he took toward it, the gold light of the fragment answering the mark on his hand the same way the shrine tablet had days before. The scarred man was already pushing himself back up from the wreckage of the doorway, blood at the corner of his mouth, fury replacing the cold calculation that had marked his face throughout the fight. No, he snarled, lunging for the altar himself. Issei reached it first, closing his gauntlet hand around the cloth-wrapped fragment a half-second before the man's claws could, and the moment his skin made contact with what lay beneath the cloth, the entire sanctum flooded with gold light bright enough to swallow every shadow in the room. Drake's roar of recognition thundered through Issei's mind, ancient and triumphant, and for one suspended heartbeat Issei felt something vast and patient stir fully awake for the first time in 1,000 years, pressing warm and certain against the edges of his own thoughts, not overwhelming him, only settling beside him, like an old king recognizing an heir it had waited a very long time to meet. The scarred man staggered backward from the light, shielding his eyes, and by the time it faded he was already in retreat, calling a ragged order to whatever remained of his scattered fighters outside. Issei stood in the center of the sanctum, breathing hard, the fragment now resting quiet and dim in his open palm, a smooth dark stone etched with the same crown pattern that marked his own hand, no longer glowing but no longer entirely lifeless either, humming faintly against his skin like a second heartbeat settling into rhythm with his own. Outside, the sounds of battle were already fading, the purest fighters breaking off their attack and melting back into the mist now that their leader had fled the field. By the time Issei made his way back out into the courtyard, fragment held carefully in one hand, Rias was already moving to meet him, relief and fierce pride warring plainly across her face. "You have it," she said, not quite a question. "I have it," Issei confirmed, holding the stone out for her to see. "He ran the second I grabbed it. I don't think he was expecting the light." "None of us were," Akeno said, landing lightly beside them, a few scorch marks on her sleeves the only sign of how hard she had been fighting minutes earlier. "That was not a small reaction, Issei. I felt it from across the courtyard." Kuroka and Kaneko arrived together a moment later, both breathing hard but unharmed, Kuroka's gaze fixing immediately on the stone in Issei's hand with an expression somewhere between relief and awe. "2 fragments now," she said quietly. "Nya. I did not expect to feel this proud of a dragon boy I met 3 days ago." The 2 elderly Nikomata approached more slowly, leaning on each other for support, and the elder with the bandaged arm bowed low before Issei with a formality that made him distinctly uncomfortable. "You have done our clan a great service today," she said. "Whatever debt was owed by the old treaty, consider it repaid in full." "You don't owe me anything," Issei said quickly. "I just didn't want anyone getting hurt over something that was mine to begin with." The elder's weathered face creased into a small, knowing smile. "That is precisely the answer a worthy vessel should give," she said, and glanced meaningfully toward Kuroka and Kaneko standing close together for the first time in what was clearly years. "It seems this crown of yours is already doing more good than the old stories gave it credit for." Rias placed a hand gently on Issei's shoulder, turning him to face her fully, her eyes bright with something that went beyond simple relief. "2 fragments," she said. "One from a shrine that guarded its secret faithfully for 1,000 years, and one reclaimed from people who tried to weaponize it against you before you'd even fully understood what you were carrying. That is not a small victory, Issei. That is the beginning of something the old factions are going to have to start taking very seriously." "2 down," Issei said, looking at the stone still warm in his palm. "2 to go. One nobody but Warden can reach, and one that somebody already stole." He looked up, meeting Rias's steady gaze. "This isn't going to get easier from here, is it?" "No," Rias admitted, though her smile did not waver. "But it is going to get more interesting. And I intend to be there for every step of it." Behind them, the mist over the valley was already beginning to lift, morning sunlight breaking through in long golden shafts that caught the shrine's weathered roof and turned the whole scene, for just a moment, into something that looked almost peaceful, as if the valley itself understood that a very old wound had, at long last, begun quietly to heal. The trip back to Ko passed in a strange, exhausted contentment, the whole peerage crowded loosely together on the return path, adrenaline slowly draining away into the particular bone-deep tiredness that came after a real fight rather than a training exercise. Kuroka walked beside her sister for most of the journey, the two of them talking in low, careful voices that Issei made a deliberate point not to listen too closely to, sensing that whatever mending was happening there needed space more than an audience. By the time they reached the old school building that evening, a familiar figure was already waiting for them on the front steps, silver hair immaculate despite the late hour, expression as calmly composed as ever. Grafia, Rias said, straightening instinctively at the sight of her sister-in-law. I wasn't expecting you. Surzek sent me the moment the flare from the shrine reached the underworld sensors, Grafia said, her gaze sweeping over the tired, battle-worn peerage before settling, with particular attention, on Issei and the fragments still held carefully in his hand. 2 fragments recovered within a single week. That is not a pace anyone anticipated, least of all the factions who assumed this crown would remain broken indefinitely. Is that a problem? Issei asked warily. It is an opportunity, and a risk, in roughly equal measure, Grafia said. My husband asked me to extend an offer. The underworld is prepared to provide quiet support, resources, information, and a measure of protection, for as long as this search continues, provided it is understood that the Gremory house does not seek to claim the crown for itself, only to see it safely gathered and eventually, its bearer left free to decide his own path with it. Rias's chin lifted slightly, pride and caution both audible in her voice. And if I refuse the offer on his behalf, then Surzek respects that, and continues to worry from a greater distance, Grafia said, the faintest hint of warmth softening her otherwise formal tone. He is fond of you, Rias. He would simply prefer not to learn from a warden's report that his sister was gathering ancient crown fragments without so much as a phone call home. Rias's mouth twitched despite herself. Tell him I appreciate the offer. And that I will call next time. He will hold you to that, Grafia said, and turned her attention back to Issei, studying him for a long moment with an intensity that made him straighten under the weight of it. For what it is worth, Hyoudou Issei, the underworld remembers old stories about the last dragon emperor differently than the fallen or the yokai factions do. Some of the oldest devil houses considered that throne a check against exactly the kind of unchecked power that nearly consumed every faction during the last great war. There are those among us who would very much like to see it whole again, in the right hands. She inclined her head slightly. I hope, for everyone's sake, that yours prove to be those hands. She departed as quietly as she had arrived, leaving the courtyard settling into the ordinary sounds of evening, crickets in the grass, the distant hum of Koa's streetlights flickering on one by one. Rias exhaled slowly once she was gone, some of the day's tension visibly draining from her shoulders. Well, she said, that is one more faction aware of what we're doing. I would rather it had stayed quieter longer, but I suppose there was never a realistic version of this where it did. At least it's a faction on our side, Kiba offered. For now, Akeno said, though not unkindly. Old alliances have a way of shifting when a prize this large is involved. I do not think we should assume anyone's goodwill will last indefinitely, however sincere it seems tonight. Issei looked down at the 2 fragments now resting together in a small lacquered box Akeno had produced from somewhere, the crown patterns on each stone humming faintly in quiet resonance with each other, and with the mark on his own hand, 3 points of the same old constellation drawing slowly, patiently, back together after 1,000 years apart. 2 fragments, he said softly, half to himself. It doesn't feel like I've actually done anything yet. It just feels like the start of something a lot bigger. That is because it is the start of something a lot bigger, Rias said, coming to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his in a gesture that had become, over the past strange week, entirely natural between them. But you are not facing that start unprepared, and you are not facing it alone. Whatever comes next, whoever else decides this crown is worth fighting over, we have already proven we can hold our ground. She looked up at him, crimson eyes steady in the gathering dark. That matters more than you're giving yourself credit for tonight. Issei let her words settle over him, the exhaustion of the day beginning to ease into something quieter and more grounded, and found, not for the first time since that first flare of gold light in the courtyard, that whatever the coming weeks demanded of him, he would rather face them here, surrounded by people who had already chosen, without hesitation, to stand beside him through all of it. Azazel returned 3 days later, dropping into the clubroom through the window rather than the door, as though doors were beneath his dignity as Governor-General, and tossed the thin folder onto the low table with the satisfied air of a man delivering excellent, terrible news in equal measure. Good news first, or bad news first? He asked, settling into his usual spot against the window frame. Just tell us, Rias said, already reaching for the folder. Fine, no fun at all, you people. Azazel waved a hand as she opened it, revealing a handful of surveillance photographs and hastily scrawled notes. Good news, I found out who's been sitting on the stolen fragment for the last several decades. Bad news, it's a name that's going to make everyone in this room a great deal more nervous than the purists did. Kuroka, curled comfortably in the corner with Kaneko close beside her, went very still at the first photograph Rias pulled free. It showed a tall, narrow-faced man in old-fashioned robes standing before a ruined temple, his expression unreadable even in the grainy image. You recognize him, Rias said, watching Kuroka's reaction closely. Everyone in yokai country recognizes him, eventually, if they live long enough, Kuroka said, voice tight in a way Issei had not heard from her before, not even during the tensest moments in the valley. That's Chojiro. He used to be one of the wardens, the same order that came to visit your basement a few days ago. He broke from them decades back, decided a fragment of the crown was too valuable to leave scattered and forgotten, and went looking for one of his own to claim. A warden who defected, Kiba said slowly. That would explain how he found a fragment the rest of his order missed. Worse than that, Azazel said, tapping the second photograph, which showed the same man standing before a small, isolated gathering of robed figures, faces mostly hidden. He's not alone anymore. Word from my contacts suggests he's built a small following over the years, mostly disillusioned wardens and a handful of opportunists from various factions who think a broken crown reassembled under the right hand could be turned into something very useful indeed. Rias's expression darkened. Useful for what? For whatever an old, patient man with a grudge against the factions that exiled him decides it should be useful for, Azazel said, all trace of his usual humor gone now. That's the part that worries me. Chojiro isn't hunting the crown to protect it, and he isn't hunting it to destroy it either. He wants to wear it. Which means if he gets his hands on Issei's fragment, or on Issei himself, he's not going to hesitate the way the purists did. The clubroom fell into a heavy silence, the two lacquered fragments on the table between them humming faintly, seemingly indifferent to the weight of the conversation happening around them. Where is he now? Issei asked finally. That, Azazel admitted, is the part one don't have a clean answer for. My best guess puts him somewhere in the mountains along the old dragon territories, but that's an educated guess based on old sightings, not a confirmed location. Which brings me to the third fragment, actually, and why I think finding it might matter more right now than chasing after Chojiro directly. The one no devil, angel, or fallen can reach, Rias said, recalling the warden's words from days before. Exactly. From what I've been able to piece together, that fragment was placed under the direct protection of one of the old dragon kings, back when the crown was first scattered, specifically because dragonkind wanted at least one piece kept somewhere outside the political reach of the other three factions. Azazel glanced at Issei with something that looked, for once, almost sympathetic. Which means if you want that fragment, kid, you're going to have to go ask a dragon king for it. Politely. And dragon kings are not known for being especially patient with polite requests from a very young Sekiryutai who happens to be carrying an ancient throne around inside his own gauntlet. Drake's rumble carried through the room, tinged with something that might, in a lesser dragon, have been called nerves. That particular dragon king and I have something of a history, partner. I would not call it friendly. Great, Issei said, dropping his head into his hands. Just great. First an ancient warden faction, then a purist yokai cult, and now apparently I have to go politely ask a dragon king who already hates my partner for a piece of a crown he's been guarding for 1,000 years. Akeno's hand found his shoulder, warm and steadying. Then it is fortunate, she said, that you have never once let impossible odds stop you before. Her smile carried none of her usual teasing, only quiet, genuine confidence. We will go with you. All of us. Dragon King or not, I do not think even he will find it so easy to turn away an entire devil peerage standing behind their king's chosen dragon. Rias nodded firmly, already reaching for the folder again, mind visibly turning toward logistics. Azazel, can you arrange an introduction, or at least point us toward where this dragon king can actually be found? I can do better than that, Azazel said, grin returning slowly, though something more serious lingered behind it. I can tell you his name. Whether that's a comfort or a warning, I genuinely couldn't say. He paused for effect, clearly enjoying it despite the gravity of the moment. You're going to want to meet Tannen. Drake's groan echoed through the clubroom loud enough that even Kaniko's ears flattened at the sound. Of all the dragon kings scattered across this earth, partner, you would have to be sent to precisely the one who still remembers, in vivid and ungenerous detail, the exact reasons he and I stopped speaking centuries ago. Wonderful, Issei muttered, already dreading the conversation to come. Absolutely wonderful. Tannen's territory turned out to be a stretch of uninhabited mountains far to the north, reachable only by a magic circle keyed specifically to a set of coordinates Azazel had, with visible reluctance, dug up from an old fallen angel survey conducted decades earlier. The transition dropped the peerage onto a wide stone plateau ringed by jagged peaks, the air thin and sharp with cold despite the season, utterly silent except for the wind. He knows we're here, Kuroka said quietly, ears swiveling, tail bristling slightly despite her attempt to appear unbothered. I can feel something watching from the peaks. Something big. Everyone stay calm, Rias said, though her own hands had drifted subtly closer to where her magic gathered fastest. We came to ask, not to fight. The mountain answered her with a low rumble that had nothing to do with weather, and a shadow passed overhead vast enough to blot out the pale winter sun entirely. Tannen landed on the far side of the plateau in a crash of displaced stone and snow, easily 3 times the size of any dragon Issei had encountered before, deep green scales scarred from what looked like centuries of battles, eyes like twin furnaces fixing immediately, unerringly, on the gauntlet at Issei's side. Security, Tannen's voice rolled across the plateau like thunder-given words, ancient and deeply unimpressed. I felt your little flare of gold light from 3 mountains away and hoped, foolishly, that it meant nothing to do with me. And yet here you stand, on my mountain, wearing a mark I have not seen in a very long time. Drake didn't send us to bother you, Issei said, forcing himself to hold the enormous dragon's gaze despite every instinct screaming to look away. We came because there's a fragment of the Dragon Emperor's crown here, and I need it. And I figured showing up and asking politely was better than sneaking around behind your back. Tannen's furnace eyes narrowed, and Drake's voice rumbled from the gauntlet, wary but steady. It has been a long time, old rival. I see the years have not softened your temper. They have not softened my memory either, Drake, Tannen said, the ground trembling slightly under the weight of his displeasure. I remember precisely why the Dragon Kings agreed to keep this fragment out of the other faction's reach. We did not scatter that crown because we distrusted devils, or fallen, or gods. We scattered it because we had watched, firsthand, what happens when even a well-meaning dragon believes itself wise enough to wear that throne alone. His gaze shifted fully onto Issei, weighing him with a scrutiny that made the boy feel, for a long moment, unbearably young and small. Tell me, boy, why should I hand a piece of that crown to a human child who has carried Drake's power for what? A single year. 2. Because I'm not asking for it so I can rule anything, Issei said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the words came easily, honestly, without hesitation. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't go looking for a crown or a throne or whatever the last dragon emperor is even supposed to mean. It found me. And now there are people out there, a warden who broke off from his own order, who wants to gather it for himself and doesn't care who gets hurt along the way. I'd rather it end up whole and safe with someone who never wanted the power in the first place than broken apart forever, and eventually stolen by someone who does. Tannen was silent for a long moment, furnace eyes studying Issei with an intensity that made the wind itself seem to hold its breath. A pretty answer, the old dragon said finally. But answers are cheap, boy. I did not survive as long as I have by trusting pretty answers alone. Tannen's massive head lowered slightly, bringing one enormous eye level with Issei's own. If you want this fragment, you will earn it the way every worthy claimant to that crown has earned their pieces since the beginning. You will face a trial of my choosing, and you will face it honestly, without your king's magic or your peerage's sword standing between you and the outcome. Only your own strength, and whatever that mark on your hand actually means when tested properly for the first time. Issei doesn't have to prove anything to you, Rias said sharply, stepping forward despite the sheer scale of the dragon looming over them. Then he does not receive the fragment, Tannen said simply, unmoved. I did not survive 1,000 years of guarding this mountain by making exceptions for devil heiresses fond of their pawns, however capable he may be. Issei placed a hand gently on Rias's arm before she could argue further, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that surprised even himself. It's fine, Bucho. If this is what it takes, I want to do it properly. He turned back to Tannen, straightening his shoulders. Tell me what the trial is. Tannen's furnace eyes gleamed with something that might, on a less terrifying creature, have passed for approval. A simple test, as these things go. You will fly with me, to the peak above us, and you will hold that gauntlet's power at its highest boost for as long as it takes to reach the summit, without faltering, without collapsing under the strain, and without once asking me to slow down for your sake. Many claimants across the centuries have failed this exact test in the first 100 feet. If you reach the summit still standing, still boosted, still yourself, the fragment is yours freely, and I will owe your dragon an apology besides. Issei swallowed hard, glancing briefly at the distant, snow-wrapped peak rising impossibly high above them, then back at Tannen's enormous, waiting form. Partner, Drake said quietly, this will not be easy. Even for me, holding maximum boost that long without collapsing would be a genuine trial. Then it's a good thing I've got 1,000-year-old dragon with a lot of stubborn pride helping me, Issei said, and summoned the boosted gear in a flash of green light, the gold crown mark rising steady along the back of his hand, and nodded once, firmly, toward Tannen. Let's go. The climb began the moment Tannen launched himself skyward, and Issei, gripping tight to a ridge of scale along the great dragon's back with one hand while the other blazed steadily with boosted green light, understood within the first 100 feet exactly why Tannen had called this trial simple only in the sense that its rules were easy to state, not easy to survive. Boost, Drake intoned, and Issei felt the familiar surge of doubled strength roll through him, followed almost immediately by another. Boost. The wind tore at his clothes and hair as Tannen climbed, effortless and merciless, the mountain air growing thinner and colder with every passing second, and still the boosts kept coming, layering strain upon strain, power building toward a peak Issei's body had never been asked to sustain for this long before. By the 3rd minute his arms had begun to shake. By the 5th, his vision had started to blur at the edges, the accumulated weight of the boosted power pressing down on him like a physical thing, demanding to be released, to be spent all at once in the explosive burst his body instinctively wanted to give it. He gritted his teeth and held on, refusing to let the power collapse, refusing to slow the climb, matching Tannen's punishing ascent inch by grueling inch. You are stronger than most who have attempted this, Tannen's voice rumbled beneath him, and if Issei had the breath to spare he might have caught the note of surprise buried in it. But strength alone has never been the true measure of this trial, boy. Tell me. Why do you hold on? What is it, precisely, that keeps you climbing when every part of your body screams to let go? Issei's jaw clenched against the strain, thoughts scattering and reforming in fragments, as he forced himself to answer. Because people are counting on me. Rias, Akeno, Kaneko, Kuroka. All of them, standing down there in the snow, waiting to see if I fall apart. Another boost thundered through him, and he swayed dangerously before catching himself. And because this crown, whatever it actually is, it's not just mine. Not really. It's theirs too now. Everyone who's already bled a little to help me carry it this far. Tannen's climb did not slow, but something in the rhythm of his wing beats shifted, steadier now, as though the old dragon had, somewhere in the past several minutes, quietly decided the answer he was hearing mattered. The summit rose closer through the thinning cloud cover, jagged and windswept, and Issei felt the accumulated boosts pressing harder than ever against the edges of his control, a dozen doublings stacked one atop another, demanding release with a violence that made his teeth ache. He thought, distantly, through the haze of strain, of Akeno's hand steady on his shoulder in the clubroom, of Rias's crimson eyes meeting his in the mountain wind below, of the quiet, hard-won trust in Kaniko's voice when she agreed to face her sister for his sake, and found, somehow, one more reserve of stubbornness buried beneath all of it. Not yet, he ground out, to himself as much as to the power straining against his skin. Not until we're there. The summit broke through the clouds at last, and Tannen's great wings flared wide to slow their ascent, talons finding purchase on the windswept stone with a grace that belied his enormous size. Issei slid from his back the moment they landed, legs buckling immediately beneath him, boosted power still blazing furious and unspent along the gauntlet, and forced himself, through sheer stubborn will, to remain standing rather than collapse into the snow. Enough, Drake said gently, and the accumulated boosts released all at once in a controlled pulse of green light that scattered snow in a wide ring around Issei's feet, leaving him gasping, drained, and utterly, gloriously still upright. Tannen regarded him for a long, silent moment, furnace eyes unreadable against the pale sky. It has been 300 years, the old dragon said finally, since anyone has stood on this summit still standing at the end of that climb. His massive head lowered, bringing one eye close enough that Issei could see, reflected in it, his own exhausted, snow-dusted, thoroughly wrung-out face. You did not fall apart, boy. And more than that, you did not climb this mountain for yourself. I have watched a great many claimants seek this fragment over the centuries. You are the first in longer than I care to admit who answered that question honestly, rather than with whatever they thought I wanted to hear. Tannen shifted, one enormous claw reaching carefully into a hollow near the summit's peak, withdrawing a second dark stone fragment, twin to the one already resting in the lacquered box back at the plateau, and set it with surprising gentleness into Issei's trembling, outstretched palm. The fragment is yours, freely given, Tannen said. Guard it as carefully as you guarded the reasons you climbed for it. And tell your dragon, when you see fit, that I withdraw perhaps 1/10 of the grudge I have carried against him these past centuries. Only 1/10. He still owes me a much longer apology than one mountain trial can settle. Drake's low, rumbling laugh echoed through the gauntlet, warm despite the exhaustion still weighing on Issei's limbs. I will take the 10th gladly, old rival. It is more progress than I expected from a single afternoon. Far below, Issei could just make out the small, distant shapes of his peerage watching from the plateau, and even from this height, even through the haze of exhaustion still fogging his thoughts, he could see Rias's unmistakable stance, the barely contained motion of someone who very badly wanted to fly up and check on him herself and was restraining that urge through pure force of will, and Akeno beside her, one hand raised in a small, hopeful wave that made something warm settle in Issei's chest despite the bone-deep tiredness weighing down every limb. 3 fragments, he thought, looking down at the 2 dark stones now resting together in his palm, humming in quiet resonance against the mark on his own skin. 1 more to go. And somewhere out there, an old broken warden already gathering followers of his own, waiting to see whether the crown would be gathered by worthy hands or stolen by patient, grudge-worn ones instead. He closed his fingers gently around the fragments, and allowed himself, just for a moment atop that windswept summit, to feel something that had been in increasingly short supply over the past exhausting week. Hope. The flight back down from Tannen's summit felt shorter than the climb up, though Issei suspected that had more to do with the fact that he spent most of it slumped gratefully against the old dragon's back, too exhausted to do much more than watch the mountains slide past beneath them. By the time Tannen's great wings flared to land back on the plateau, the peerage was already rushing forward to meet them, and Issei found himself, for a brief, undignified moment, more or less caught between Rias and Akeno as his legs finally gave out entirely. I'm fine, he insisted, even as Rias's arm braced firmly under his shoulder and Akeno's hands checked him over with brisk, practiced efficiency. Just tired. Really tired. You held maximum boost for the better part of 10 minutes climbing a mountain, Akeno said, not letting up on her assessment despite his protests. You are entitled to be more than a little tired, Issei. 3 fragments, Kuroka said, peering over Rias's shoulder at the 2 dark stones Issei still held loosely in one hand, gold eyes bright with something that looked almost like wonder. "Yeah. I did not actually think we'd get this far this fast when I showed up on your doorstep a week ago." "None of us did," Rias admitted, though the pride in her voice was unmistakable. She looked up at Tannen, still watching the small gathering with those enormous furnace eyes, and inclined her head in a formal, respectful bow. "Thank you for testing him fairly, and for trusting your judgment enough to hand over something you've guarded for centuries." "I did not do it for you, devil," Tannen rumbled, though there was no real bite in the words. "I did it because your pawn earned it, honestly, in a way few claimants ever have." His gaze settled on Issei one final time, something almost warm flickering behind the ancient fire of his eyes. "Rest, boy. You will need your strength again before this is finished. I do not think the man hunting the fourth fragment will offer you a mountain to climb. He will simply try to take what he wants, and count on cruelty to make up whatever ground honesty cannot." The warning settled over the small gathering like a shadow, and Rias's expression sobered accordingly, some of the celebratory warmth of the moment tempering into renewed focus. "We'll be ready for him," she said. Tannen huffed, a sound that might have been amusement, or might have simply been an old dragon clearing his throat. "See that you are." "And Sekirudii." The old dragon's gaze shifted briefly to the gauntlet at Issei's side, and through it, presumably, to Drag himself. "Tell your host he fights well, for a human boy still finding his footing. Perhaps in another century I will admit as much to his face without complaint." Drag's rumbling laugh answered from the gauntlet, warm and genuinely pleased. "I will pass along the compliment, old rival, though I suspect it will lose nothing in translation." With that, Tannen launched himself skyward once more, powerful wings scattering fresh snow across the plateau, and within moments had vanished back into the clouds wreathing his mountain, leaving the peerage alone once more in the thin, cold air, 3 fragments now secured, and one final piece of the crown still waiting somewhere out there in the hands of a man who intended, quite plainly, to take it by force rather than earn it honestly. The magic circle Azazel had provided carried them back to Ko within minutes, the transition from freezing mountain air to the familiar warmth of the old-school building's basement leaving Issei blinking against the sudden change. He sank gratefully into one of the low chairs the moment they arrived, every muscle in his body protesting the day's exertions all at once now that the adrenaline had finally worn off. "You should eat something," Kaneko said, appearing at his elbow with a plate of onigiri that had materialized from somewhere with her usual quiet efficiency. "And sleep. You look like you're about to fall over." "Thanks, Kaneko," Issei said, accepting the plate gratefully. He glanced over at her and Kuroka, who had settled into the corner together again, close enough this time that their shoulders touched without either of them seeming to mind. "How are you two doing? After everything with the shrine, I mean." Kaneko considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "Better than I expected," she admitted finally. "Still complicated. Probably always going to be complicated. But better." Kuroka's tail curled contentedly around her sister's ankle, an old, familiar gesture that looked, for the first time since her arrival, entirely unguarded. "We've got a lot of years to make up for," she said. "But yeah, I think we're finally starting somewhere real, instead of just circling each other from a distance. That's more than I expected to get out of this whole crown business, honestly." Rias settled into the chair across from Issei, still watching him with the particular quiet attentiveness she reserved for moments after real danger had passed, as if reassuring herself, piece by piece, that everyone had actually come home safely. 3 fragments, she said softly, echoing Kuroka's earlier words. "One more, and then whatever this crown actually turns out to mean for you gets decided for good." "Assuming Chojiro doesn't get there first," Issei said, around a mouthful of rice. "Assuming that," Rias agreed, expression sobering. "Azazel is already working on narrowing down his location further. Whatever comes next, we will meet it prepared." She reached over, resting her hand briefly over his on the arm of the chair, a small, grounding gesture that had become, over the course of this strange and exhausting week, entirely natural between them. "For tonight, though, I think you have earned the right to simply rest, and let the rest of us worry about tomorrow's problems for a change." Akeno, curled into the chair beside Rias with a fresh cup of tea already steaming in her hands, hummed her agreement. Bucho is right. You climbed a mountain today, quite literally, in more ways than one. Allow yourself to feel proud of that before the next crisis inevitably arrives to demand your attention. Issei let himself sink back into the chair, exhaustion and quiet contentment mingling in a way that felt, despite everything, remarkably good, surrounded by people who had chosen, again and again over the past week, to stand beside him without hesitation. 3 fragments rested safely in the lacquered box on the table, humming faintly in resonance with the mark on his own hand. One final piece of a 1,000-year-old crown still waiting somewhere out there in the dark. Tomorrow, he suspected, would bring the hardest fight yet. Tonight, at least, he allowed himself to simply rest, and be grateful for exactly how much he had already found worth fighting for. The peaceful lull lasted exactly 2 days before it shattered. Issei was walking home from a late training session, Drake's gauntlet dormant beneath his sleeve, thoughts drifting pleasantly toward dinner, when the streetlights along his usual route flickered and died one by one ahead of him, plunging the quiet residential street into sudden, unnatural darkness. Careful, partner, Drake warned, voice sharpening instantly. Something is wrong here. A figure stepped out from the deeper shadow between 2 houses, tall and narrow-faced, robes the faded color of old parchment, and Issei recognized him immediately from Azazel's surveillance photographs even before the man spoke, cold satisfaction evident in every unhurried movement. Hyoudou Issei, Chojiro said, voice dry and precise, utterly unlike the harsh contempt of the purest leader Issei had fought days earlier. This was something colder, older, and far more patient. I have waited a very long time to finally meet the vessel my former order spent so many decades hoping would never wake. Issei summoned the boosted gear immediately, gold crown light rising steady along the back of his hand, putting himself instinctively into a defensive stance despite the sudden hammering of his heart. You're the one who stole the 4th fragment. Stole implies it belonged to someone with a legitimate claim to keep it from me, Chojiro said, unbothered, drifting a few unhurried steps closer despite the gauntlet's warning glow. I merely recognized, decades before anyone else, that a crown scattered out of fear rather than wisdom was destined to be reassembled eventually, by someone. I decided that someone would be me, long before I ever learned your name. It's not going to be you, Issei said, forcing steel into his voice despite the unease crawling up his spine at the man's utter, unshaken calm. Chojiro's thin lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. We shall see. I did not come tonight to fight you, boy, however capable you may have proven yourself against Tannen's little trial. I came only to look, and to offer a piece of honest advice, since I suspect no one else in your life has been willing to give it. He tilted his head slightly, studying Issei with an unsettling, clinical interest. The 3 fragments you have gathered are not, in truth, the difficult part of this crown's reassembly. The difficult part comes after, when all 4 pieces recognize each other fully for the first time, and the throne itself must decide whether the vessel holding them is strong enough to bear the whole of what it represents, rather than simply a fraction of it. His gaze sharpened. Many claimants across the centuries have gathered every fragment successfully, only to be consumed the moment the crown recognized itself whole again inside a vessel too weak to hold it. I would hate to see you survive every trial along the way, only to be undone by the final step. The words settled over Issei like ice water, and he felt Drake's presence go very still and quiet inside the gauntlet, a silence that felt, somehow, more alarming than any warning growl could have been. Is that true? Issei asked, unable to keep the edge of fear from his voice. Drake was slow to answer. It has happened before, partner. I will not lie to you about that. But it has also been survived before, by vessels who understood something the failed claimants did not. And what's that? Issei pressed. The dragon's answer was interrupted by Chojiro's dry, humorless laugh. Ask your dragon later, boy. Tonight I only wish to see the face behind the mark for myself, and to plant that particular seed of doubt where it might grow into something useful before we meet again in earnest. He began to withdraw into the shadow between the houses, robes rippling despite the absence of any wind. When that day comes, I will not be nearly so patient as I have been tonight. Gather your fragments. Prepare your peerage. and consider carefully, in whatever time you have left before that final confrontation, whether you are truly strong enough to survive becoming whole. The streetlights flickered back to life the instant he vanished fully into the shadows, as though the darkness itself had only ever existed to serve his brief, unsettling visit, leaving Issei alone on the suddenly ordinary-looking street, heart pounding, the warning ringing in his ears far louder than anything else Chojiro had said. He did not walk the rest of the way home. He ran, straight back to the old school building, bursting into the clubroom with enough force that Rias was on her feet with crimson energy already gathering before she registered who had entered. Issei, what happened? She demanded, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. Chojiro, Issei managed, still catching his breath. He found me. He didn't attack, he wanted to talk, he said. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. He said gathering the fragments isn't actually the dangerous part. He said the crown could kill me the moment all 4 pieces recognize each other, if I'm not strong enough to hold what it becomes. The clubroom fell utterly silent, every face turning toward the gauntlet at Issei's side, toward the 3 dark fragments resting in their lacquered box on the low table, humming faintly, patiently, waiting for a 4th piece that might, if Chojiro's warning proved true, complete the crown only to unmake the boy carrying it. Rias's hand found Issei's, gripping tight, her expression fierce and unyielding despite the fear plainly visible underneath it. Then we make certain you're strong enough, she said. Whatever it takes. Whatever preparation this requires. We are not gathering 3 fragments only to lose you to the 4th. Her gaze swept the room, meeting Akeno's steady eyes, Kaniko's grim determination, Kuroka's uncharacteristically serious expression, Kiba's quiet resolve. This changes our timeline. We do not chase the 4th fragment until we understand exactly what a vessel needs to survive becoming whole. Drake, I need everything you know about the claimants who failed that final step, and everything you know about the ones who survived it. It will not be a short conversation, Drake said gravely. But I will give you all of it, gladly, if it means my partner walks away from this crown alive rather than consumed by it. Issei stood in the center of the clubroom, 3 fragments waiting patiently on the table before him, the weight of Chojiro's warning settling heavier with every passing second, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, that the fight for the final piece of the crown was no longer the greatest danger he faced. The greatest danger was what happened after, when the crown was whole again for the first time in 1,000 years, and the world finally learned whether Hyoudou Issei was strong enough to wear it, or merely one more name added to a long, quiet list of those who had reached for a throne too large for the hands that held it. Drake's account took the better part of the evening to tell. The whole peerage gathered close around the low table long after the sun had set, listening in a silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling around them. There have been perhaps a dozen claimants across recorded history who gathered all 4 fragments of the crown, Drake began, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone recounting something he had witnessed firsthand rather than merely learned secondhand. Of those, 5 were consumed the moment the fragments recognized each other fully within them, the throne's full weight arriving all at once, too much and too fast for a vessel unprepared to bear it. Their bodies did not survive the transition. Their names are mostly forgotten now, footnotes in older dragon histories, cautionary tales told to discourage exactly the kind of hasty gathering you have undertaken this past week. And the others? Rias asked quietly. The ones who survived it. 7 survived, Drake said. And in every surviving case, without exception, the vessel had done one crucial thing differently from those who were consumed. They did not gather the crown alone. The room absorbed that for a moment, several gazes flicking instinctively toward Issei, who sat very still, absorbing the weight of the words. What do you mean, not alone? Issei asked. I haven't gathered any of this alone. You've all been with me every step. That is closer to the truth than you may realize, Drake said, and something in his tone shifted towards something gentler, almost proud. The throne does not test only strength of body, or even strength of will, though both matter a great deal. It tests whether the bearer has built something worth defending with that power, bonds strong enough to anchor a vessel against the full weight of a crown meant, originally, to rule over 3 warring factions at once. The 5 who were consumed approached the crown as a prize to be claimed for themselves alone. The 7 who survived approached it already surrounded by people they trusted absolutely, people whose presence gave the throne something to recognize as worth protecting, rather than merely worth possessing. Akeno's hand found Issei's on the table, quiet and certain. Then it seems we have already been doing precisely the right thing, she said, without fully understanding why it mattered so much. That's a relief, Issei admitted, though the knot of tension in his chest did not fully unwind. But it also means I can't afford to mess this up. If the bonds are what matter then you have already built more of them, and built them more honestly, than most claimants across the crown's entire history ever managed, Drake said firmly, cutting off the spiral of doubt before it could fully take root. I have carried this sacred gear through many hosts across many centuries, partner. I have never once seen bonds form as quickly, or as genuinely, as the ones surrounding you in this room tonight. If Chojiro intended his warning to frighten you into doubting yourself, he chose a poor target. Doubt is precisely the weakness that consumed the 5 who failed. Certainty in the people around you, that is the strength that carried the 7 who survived. Rias rose from her seat, expression settling into the calm, resolute focus that had guided the peerage through every crisis of the past week. Then our path forward is clear. We do not simply gather the 4th fragment and hope for the best. We use whatever time we have before that confrontation to strengthen exactly what Drake describes, and we make absolutely certain that when the moment comes, Issei walks into it surrounded by bonds too strong for any crown to break. How do we do that, exactly? Kiba asked. Bonds aren't something you can train like a sword technique. No, Akeno agreed, but they can be nurtured, deliberately, rather than left to grow on their own in the margins of a crisis. She glanced at Issei, something warm and unhurried in her expression despite the gravity of the evening. Perhaps it is time we all spent a little more effort making certain Issei knows, beyond any doubt, exactly how much he is trusted and valued by everyone in this room, rather than simply assuming he already understands it. Kaneko nodded firmly beside her sister, expression uncharacteristically open. I trust him, she said simply. That's not going to change no matter what a stolen fragment, or an old broken warden tries to threaten. Same, Kuroka added, tail curling contentedly around her sister's ankle again. Yeah, and honestly, a dragon boy who climbed a mountain for a fragment he could have just as easily fought for is exactly the kind of person I trust with something as big as an old crown. That's not flattery. That's just what I've seen this past week, plain as anything. Issei felt something tight and anxious in his chest begin, slowly, to loosen at the unguarded honesty in each voice around the table, the accumulated weight of Chojiro's warning easing, not because the danger had lessened, but because the ground beneath his feet suddenly felt considerably more solid than it had an hour before. Rias settled back into her seat beside him, her hand finding his once more, steady and certain. Then that is our task, in whatever time remains before we go looking for the 4th fragment. Not simply preparing for a fight. Preparing for what comes after it, together, the way every surviving claimant before Issei apparently understood, whether they had a name for it or not. Outside the clubroom window, the last of the evening light had faded fully into night, and somewhere out there, beyond the edge of Chojiro's warning still hung heavy in the air, an old and patient threat still gathering its own strength for the confrontation to come. But inside the small, familiar room, surrounded by the fragile, hard-won bonds of a peerage that had chosen, again and again, to stand together rather than apart, Issei allowed himself, for the first time since that unsettling encounter on the darkened street, to believe that when the final fragment was finally found, and the crown at last made whole, he would not be facing it alone, and that, if Drake's account of history held true, might well prove to be the only thing that mattered. Sona arrived the following afternoon, finding Rias alone on the clubroom balcony a few minutes before the rest of the peerage was due to gather for evening training, her expression carrying the particular sharpness she reserved for matters she considered urgent enough to interrupt a friend's rare quiet moment. You look tired, Sona said by way of greeting, settling into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. I am tired, Rias admitted. Gathering 3 fragments of an ancient crown in a week will do that. I imagine it will. Sona adjusted her glasses, the gesture as much a habit of thought as of vanity. I came because my own research turned up something you should know before you go looking for the fourth fragment. Chojiro's following is larger than Azazel's initial estimate suggested. My contacts in the underworld's intelligence circles count closer to 30 sympathizers now, scattered across several factions, most of them drawn less by loyalty to the man himself than by simple opportunism. They believe a reassembled crown, in the right hands, could be leveraged into considerable political power regardless of who ultimately claims to wear it. Rias's jaw tightened. So even if we recover the fourth fragment safely, he'll have 30 people trying to take it from Issei afterward. Possibly more by the time you're ready to move, Sona said. Which is precisely why I think you should reconsider going after it alone, even with your own peerage at full strength. This is no longer simply a matter of protecting Issei from one determined man with a grudge. It has become a small, quiet war being fought in the margins of every faction at once, and wars are rarely won by a single household acting in isolation, however capable that household may be. What are you suggesting? Rias asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. I am suggesting you formally request support, Sona said. From my peerage, certainly, since you already have that regardless of formality. But also from the wider network your brother offered through Graphia, and quite possibly from Azazel's own resources within the fallen angel ranks. Chojiro is counting on you continuing to treat this as Issei's private burden, something the Gremory peerage alone must shoulder. The moment you prove him wrong, the moment this becomes visibly, undeniably a matter the wider factions have chosen to stand behind together, his 30 sympathizers become considerably less appealing allies to a man they can no longer pretend is quietly winning. Rias considered this for a long moment, gazing out over the darkening courtyard where, even now, she could hear the familiar sounds of her peerage beginning to gather for evening training, Issei's voice carrying faintly on the breeze as he traded easy banter with Kiba near the old cherry tree. You're right, she said finally. I have been treating this as something only we could carry, partly out of pride, and partly, I think, because some part of me still worries that inviting too many outside hands into Issei's crown only increases the number of people who might eventually decide they want a piece of it for themselves. She exhaled slowly, some of the day's tension visibly easing from her shoulders. But you're right that pride alone will not keep him safe against 30 sympathizers and a patient, grudge-worn warden who has had decades to plan for exactly this moment. Then let me help you build that wider support properly, Sona said, something warmer entering her usually crisp tone. You are my closest friend, Rias. I am not offering out of obligation. I am offering because I want to see this succeed, and because I have grown rather fond of your idiot pawn over the past year, against my own better judgment. Rias's answering smile was small but genuine. I'll hold you to that description of him. He'll be thrilled to hear Sona Citri called him her idiot pawn. He will hear no such thing from me directly, Sona said primly, though the corner of her mouth twitched despite herself. Some reputations require careful maintenance. Below them, in the courtyard, Issei glanced up toward the balcony, catching sight of the two of them deep in conversation, and offered a small, curious wave before Kiba's training strike forced his attention back to the sparring match at hand. Rias watched him for a moment longer, something fond and fiercely protective settling behind her eyes, before turning back to Sona with renewed resolve. Then let's build that support, she said. Properly, and quickly. If Chojiro intends to use the coming weeks to gather strength around himself, we will use them just as deliberately to make certain that whatever he's built, he finds it standing against something far larger and far more united than he ever anticipated having to face. Sona rose, adjusting her glasses once more, already mentally cataloging the calls she intended to make before the evening was through. I'll begin reaching out tonight. In the meantime, Rias, take care of yourself as well as him. A tired king makes for a vulnerable peerage, whatever crown her pawn happens to be carrying. She departed as briskly as she had arrived, leaving Rias alone on the balcony once more, the evening light fading slowly toward dusk over the courtyard below, where Issei's laughter carried up faintly on the breeze, bright and unguarded despite everything looming on the horizon. Rias allowed herself, for just a moment, to simply watch him, to feel the quiet, steady warmth that had grown between them across this strange and demanding week, before straightening her shoulders and turning to join the evening's training herself, one more piece of a much larger effort now underway to ensure that whatever waited at the end of this search, Issei would face it surrounded by more allies, more strength, and more genuine, hard-won trust than any claimant to that ancient crown had ever gathered before him. The fourth fragment was still out there, guarded by a patient man's growing following, and the true test of the crown's reassembly still loomed unanswered beyond it. But for the first time since Chojiro's unsettling visit on the darkened street, Rias felt something steadier than fear settling into place around the edges of that uncertainty, the quiet, growing certainty that whatever came next, they would not be facing it as a single household alone, but as the beginning of an alliance patient old grudges had never accounted for, and were, perhaps, already too late to stop. That evening, once training had wound down and the rest of the peerage had drifted off toward their usual evening routines, Issei found Rias still lingering on the balcony, watching the last colors fade from the sky with an expression more thoughtful than tired. "Sona tell you something serious?" he asked, joining her at the railing. "She told me we need help," Rias said. "More than just us. Chojiro's built a following, and pride alone isn't going to be enough to keep you safe from 30 sympathizers with a decade's head start on planning." She glanced sideways at him. "I've decided to ask for it. Properly. Surzex, Azazel, whoever else is willing to stand behind this before the final confrontation arrives." Issei considered that for a moment, watching the first stars emerge over the darkening rooftops of Kuo. "A week ago I would have said I didn't want to be a burden big enough to need that much help," he admitted. "But I think Drake's right. The bonds are the point, not just the fragments. So if asking for more help means more people standing with us when it matters, I'm not going to argue." Rias's hand found his on the railing, and she smiled, small and genuine, the worry in her eyes easing just slightly at his answer. "Good," she said. "Because I intend to gather every ally this crown's history has ever shown us matters, and I do not plan on losing a single one of you to a man who has spent decades nursing a grudge instead of building anything worth protecting himself." Below them, the courtyard settled into the quiet hush of evening, 3 fragments resting safely inside the old school building, one final piece still waiting somewhere beyond Koa's borders, and a patient, dangerous man already gathering his own strength for the reckoning still to come. Issei stayed on the balcony a while longer after Rias finally went inside, watching the stars fill in one by one above the rooftops, and found himself thinking, not for the first time that week, how strange it was that a discovery which had begun in fear, a stray devil's husk splitting open to reveal something that should not have existed, had led him here instead, to a balcony full of quiet resolve and people who had chosen, without hesitation, to stand beside him against whatever was still to come. 3 fragments. One more to find. And somewhere out there, a man who believed patience and grudges could outlast bonds forged honestly across a single, extraordinary week. Issei intended to prove him wrong, whatever it cost, and for the first time since Chojiro's warning had first settled cold and heavy in his chest, he found he was no longer afraid to face that proof alone in his own thoughts. He would not be facing any of it alone at all. 2 weeks passed before Rias finally called the gathering complete, and by the end of it the old school building's basement training hall had come to resemble something closer to a war room than a clubhouse, maps spread across every available surface, alliances sketched out in careful, overlapping circles that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. "Let's confirm where everyone stands," Rias said, standing at the head of the low table with the composed authority that had settled more fully into her over the past 2 weeks of constant coordination. "Sona, my full peerage, ready to move on your word," Sona said, adjusting her glasses. "We've also secured quiet cooperation from 2 other student council contacts in neighboring territories, should reinforcements become necessary." "Graphia, on behalf of the underworld," Graphia said, her presence in the room now familiar enough that nobody so much as blinked at her sudden appearance near the doorway. "Surzex has authorized a small strike team on standby, along with intelligence support tracking Chojiro's movements. He wished me to remind you, again, that you are welcome to call sooner than the last possible moment." "Noted," Rias said, with the faint, fond exasperation of someone who had heard the same gentle reprimand several times already. "Azazel, Grigory's providing aerial reconnaissance, and a small extraction team in case things go sideways," Azazel said from his usual perch against the window frame. I've also managed to peel off 2 of Chojiro's sympathizers with nothing more than a good conversation and a reminder of exactly how badly this ends for opportunists who back the losing side of a fight like this. Word's starting to spread that his following isn't nearly as united as he'd like everyone to believe. Kuroka, seated close beside Kaneko as had become her habit over the past weeks, raised a hand. The clan elders send their thanks for what Issei did at the shrine, and their support besides. A dozen capable fighters, ready to move the moment you give the word. Nya, and my sister's the one who convinced most of them, for the record. I'm just the messenger this time. Kaneko's ears twitched, the closest she came to visible embarrassment. They needed convincing that helping actually mattered. That's all I did? That's plenty, Rias said warmly, before turning her attention finally to Issei, who had been quietly absorbing the scope of what had been assembled around him over the past 2 weeks with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. Issei. This is what asking for help looks like, when the people around you actually care about the outcome. All of this, gathered in 2 weeks, because enough people decided your fight was worth standing behind. Issei looked around the crowded room, at Sona's calm confidence, Graphia's quiet formality, Azazel's characteristic irreverence undercut by real commitment, Kuroka and Kaneko sitting close together in a way that would have seemed impossible a month ago, Akeno watching him with steady warmth from her seat near the window, Kiba's easy readiness. And felt something in his chest settle more firmly into place than it had since Chojiro's warning first cut through the quiet of that darkened street. Thank you, he said simply, unable to find bigger words that felt adequate to the moment. All of you. I don't think I'll ever be able to properly repay this. You already have, Sona said crisply, though not unkindly. Every one of us in this room has watched you earn this support honestly, one difficult choice at a time, over the past several weeks. Consider the debt settled before it was even incurred. Rias's hand found Issei's beneath the table, steady and warm, and she turned back to the assembled group with renewed focus. Azazel, what does your intelligence say about Chojiro's current location? Now that, Azazel said, expression sobering, is the part you're going to want to hear carefully. He spread a new map across the table, marking a remote mountain temple complex with a small red circle. My scouts confirmed his stronghold 3 days ago. Old, abandoned temple grounds, originally built as a neutral meeting ground between factions centuries back, long since forgotten by everyone except, apparently, a bitter ex-warden looking for somewhere suitably symbolic to make his final stand. He tapped the map. He knows we're coming, by the way. He's known since the moment his sympathizers started peeling away. If anything, I'd guess he's been waiting for exactly this. A proper confrontation instead of more quiet maneuvering. Then we give him one, Rias said, steel entering her voice. 3 days from now. Everyone rested, everyone prepared, everyone moving together. She looked around the room one final time, meeting each set of eyes in turn. This ends with the 4th fragment secured, and with Issei walking away from that temple exactly as whole as he walked into it. I will not accept any other outcome. The room settled into determined, purposeful silence, the weight of the coming confrontation finally, fully acknowledged after 2 weeks of careful preparation, and Issei felt, beneath the understandable nerves twisting in his stomach, something steadier and more certain than fear. He was not walking into that temple alone. Whatever Chojiro had spent decades preparing, he had not prepared for this. The temple complex rose from the mist-wrapped mountainside exactly as Azazel's map had described, ancient stone buildings half reclaimed by forest, weathered statues of long-forgotten deities standing sentinel along a crumbling central courtyard where, even from a distance, the assembled peerage could see robed figures moving with purposeful, unhurried readiness. 30, maybe a few more, Kiba reported quietly, having scouted ahead and returned within minutes. Spread across the outer courtyard and what looks like the main temple hall. No sign of Chojiro himself yet. He'll be waiting inside, Rias said, studying the layout with the calm focus of a commander who had spent 2 weeks preparing for exactly this moment. He wants the confrontation to happen on his terms, in whatever space he's chosen to make his final stand. Which means our priority is clearing a path through his sympathizers without losing anyone, and getting Issei to him before those 30 fighters can regroup into something more coordinated. Sona's peerage fanned out along the tree line, a silent, disciplined presence that settled visibly steadier nerves throughout the gathered alliance. Graphia's strike team held positions slightly further back, ready to move the moment circumstances demanded it. Kuroka's dozen clan fighters melted into the mist with practiced ease, already beginning to circle toward the temple's flanks. "Remember," Rias said, addressing the full gathered alliance in a voice pitched to carry without shouting, "we are not here to destroy anyone who simply made a poor choice out of opportunism. Subdue where you can. Chojiro is the only target who matters tonight." Her gaze found Issei, standing beside her with the boosted gear already summoned, gold crown light steady along his hand. "Ready?" "Ready," Issei confirmed, and felt Drake's presence settle firmly alongside his own resolve. "Whatever comes, partner, we face it as we have faced everything else these past weeks. Together, and honestly." The assault began the moment Rias's hand fell, a coordinated surge of movement breaking from the tree line on every side at once. Kiba was first into the courtyard proper, silver blade flashing as he closed the distance to the nearest cluster of purist sympathizers, disabling 3 before they had fully registered the attack had begun. Akeno rose skyward with a crack of thunder, lightning scattering across the temple's outer wall to sow confusion among the defenders gathering there. Sona's peerage advanced in disciplined formation along the eastern approach, magic crackling in precise, coordinated bursts that overwhelmed resistance with clinical efficiency. Issei fought at Rias's side through the thick of it, boosted strength driving back every sympathizer who dared block their path toward the temple's central hall, gold light pulsing steady and certain along the gauntlet with every exchange. Around him the courtyard rang with the chaos of battle, spirit fire and steel and thunder, 30 sympathizers scattered and outmatched by an alliance 2 weeks in the careful making, exactly as Rias had promised. "There," Rias called, pointing toward the looming entrance of the temple's main hall, its ancient doors standing open despite the surrounding chaos, as though deliberately left unguarded, an invitation rather than an oversight. "That's where he's waiting." They broke through the last line of resistance together, Akeno descending to join them at the threshold, lightning still crackling faintly around her hands, Kaneko and Kuroka arriving moments later from the temple's flank, breathing hard but unharmed, the outer courtyard behind them already quieting as the remaining sympathizers, recognizing the battle's clear outcome, began surrendering rather than continuing a fight they could no longer win. "He's really just waiting for us in there," Issei said, studying the dark, silent doorway with wary unease. "That is precisely what worries me," Rias admitted. "A man who prepares for decades does not simply leave his final confrontation to chance." Drake's voice rumbled low with old, hard-won caution. "Be ready for anything, partner. A cornered enemy who has had this much time to plan rarely relies on strength alone when patience has served him better throughout." Issei nodded, tightening his grip on the gauntlet's power, and led the way through the ancient doors into the temple's main hall, the sounds of the settling battle behind them fading into an unnatural, waiting silence that pressed close around the small group as they stepped over the threshold, toward whatever final confrontation Chojiro had spent decades, and the past 2 quiet weeks, carefully preparing. The temple's main hall opened into a vast, shadowed chamber lit only by shafts of pale moonlight filtering through gaps in the crumbling roof above, ancient stone pillars rising toward the darkness like the ribs of some long-dead giant. Chojiro stood at the chamber's far end, before a raised stone dais, the 4th fragment resting in his open palm, glowing faintly with the same gold light that marked Issei's own hand. "You brought quite an army for a single fragment," Chojiro observed, unhurried, as the small group spread out cautiously behind Issei, weapons and magic ready. "I confess I underestimated how quickly you would learn to gather allies. That was, perhaps, my one true miscalculation in all of this." "It's over," Rias said, stepping forward beside Issei, crimson energy gathering steady at her fingertips. "Your sympathizers are subdued or surrendered. There's nothing left for you here except to hand over that fragment peacefully." Chojiro's thin lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Peacefully. An interesting word, from a devil heiress who marched an army into a temple to take by force what I found honestly, through decades of patient effort, while your kind and every other faction simply assumed it lost." His gaze shifted to Issei, cold, and assessing. But you did not come merely for the fragment, did you, boy? You came because some part of you still remembers my warning, and wishes to know, once and for all, whether you are strong enough to survive what comes after. I came because you stole something that isn't yours, Issei said, forcing steel into his voice despite the unease curling in his stomach. Everything else is just extra. Is it? Chojiro said softly, and closed his fingers around the fragment, the gold light flaring briefly brighter between them. Then let me offer you a choice, Hyoudou Issei, since I suspect force alone will not settle what truly needs settling here tonight. Defeat me in single combat, honestly, without your peerage intervening, and I will hand this fragment over freely, exactly as Tannen did atop his mountain. But know this. The moment our fight concludes, whether in your victory or mine, the fragment will recognize the other three already gathered, and the crown's true test will begin immediately, whether either of us is prepared for it or not. The chamber fell into tense, uncertain silence, every gaze turning toward Issei, weighing the offer and its unavoidable consequence. Issei, you don't have to accept his terms, Rias said quietly, though the strain in her voice betrayed how little she liked any of the alternatives available. I know, Issei said, studying Chojiro's calm, waiting expression across the shadowed chamber. But I think he's right about one thing. This test was always coming, whether I chose the timing or not. Better to face it here, with all of you already standing behind me, than to keep delaying it, and hoping I'll somehow be more ready later. Drake's voice rose steady and certain inside the gauntlet. Then let us finish this properly, partner, exactly as we finished every trial before it. Issei stepped forward, gold crown light rising bright and steady along his hand, meeting Chojiro's cold gaze across the shadowed distance between them. Single combat, he agreed. But the moment it's over, whatever happens next, my peerage doesn't leave this chamber. I would not expect them to, Chojiro said, and lowered himself into a ready stance, robes settling around him with unsettling calm. Very well, boy. Let us see, at long last, whether decades of patient preparation can outlast a single extraordinary month of hard-won bonds. The fight began without further warning, Chojiro closing the distance in a blur of motion that belied his age, dark energy trailing from his claws as he struck toward Issei's chest with precise, brutal efficiency. Issei barely managed to twist aside, boosted strength surging up through his arm as he countered, the two of them trading blows across the ancient stone floor in a rhythm that grew faster, more desperate. With every passing exchange, the gathered peerage watching in tense, unbreakable silence, honoring the terms of single combat even as every instinct screamed to intervene on Issei's behalf. The fight stretched longer than any Issei had faced before, Chojiro's decades of patient discipline proving a match for every boosted strike Issei threw against him, each exchange leaving new scorch marks across the ancient stone pillars, new cracks spreading through the temple's already crumbling floor. You fight well, Chojiro admitted, circling warily after a particularly brutal exchange left them both breathing hard, for someone who has carried this power for barely a year. But skill alone will not be enough tonight, boy. I have spent decades preparing precisely for this moment, refining every advantage I could gather against exactly the kind of vessel you have become. Then it's a good thing I've got more than just skill, Issei said, and pushed forward again, Drake's steady presence rising alongside his own determination, boosted strength doubling once more as he closed the distance. Boost, said the voice inside the gauntlet, low and certain, and Issei felt the familiar surge roll through him, sharper now, more focused than it had ever been during their earlier trials. Chojiro met the renewed assault with practiced ease, deflecting Issei's strike and countering with a vicious slash that caught along his shoulder, dark energy burning where it connected, and Issei staggered back, gritting his teeth against the pain. Issei. Akeno's voice cut through the chamber, tight with restrained worry, though she held her position exactly as promised. I'm fine, Issei called back, straightening despite the burning ache along his shoulder, gold crown light flaring brighter along his hand as he steadied himself. He thought, in the brief pause between exchanges, of Tannen's mountain, of the accumulated boosts he had carried all the way to that windswept summit through sheer stubborn will, of the answer he had given the old Dragon King when asked why he refused to let go. People are counting on me. The same truth held here, in this shadowed temple, exactly as certainly as it had atop that freezing peak. He surged forward again, and this time, rather than meeting Chojiro's counter head-on, twisted aside at the last possible moment, boosted speed carrying him past the older man's guard, gauntlet fist driving hard into his side with enough force to send him stumbling back several full steps, robes scattering dust and debris across the ancient floor. Chojiro caught himself against one of the towering stone pillars, breathing hard, cold eyes narrowing with something that, for the first time since the fight began, looked almost like genuine surprise. Interesting, he said softly. You are not simply relying on raw power, as I anticipated. You are learning, adapting, even mid-battle. That is a rarer quality than strength alone, in a vessel this young. I've had good teachers, Issei said, glancing briefly toward Rias and Akeno standing tense and watchful at the chamber's edge, toward Kaneko and Kuroka side by side, toward Kiba's steady, patient readiness. A lot of them, actually. Turns out that matters more than I used to think. Something shifted, subtly, in Chojiro's expression at those words, a flicker of old, buried weariness passing briefly across his composed features before vanishing back beneath his usual cold calculation. Teachers, he repeated, almost to himself. I had those too, once, before the order I served decided my ambitions, made me unfit for their ranks, and cast me aside without so much as a proper hearing. He straightened, dark energy gathering once more around his claws, expression hardening back into determined resolve. Perhaps that is the true difference between us, boy. You gathered teachers who chose to stay. I was left with only the lessons of those who chose to leave. The admission hung heavy in the shadowed air between them, and for a brief, strange moment, Issei felt something that was not quite sympathy, but was not entirely separate from it either, settle uneasily alongside his determination to finish the fight. It's not too late, Issei said, lowering his stance slightly, though he did not fully relax his guard. Whatever happened with the wardens, whatever pushed you this far, it doesn't have to end with either of us getting hurt worse than we already have tonight. Give up the fragment. Walk away. I don't think anyone in this room actually wants to see this end badly for you. For a long, suspended moment, something almost like consideration flickered behind Chojiro's cold eyes, decades of patient bitterness warring visibly against the unexpected, unguarded honesty of the offer. Then his expression hardened once more, old resolve reasserting itself with a finality that settled the matter beyond further discussion. A generous offer, he said quietly. But I have given too much of my life to this pursuit to abandon it now, on the strength of a kind word from the boy standing in the way of everything I have worked toward. He raised his claws once more, dark energy gathering with renewed, desperate intensity. Let us finish this, Hyoudou Issei. One way or another. The final exchange came swift and decisive, both fighters drawing on whatever reserves remained after the long, grueling battle, Chojiro's dark energy colliding with the full, boosted force of Issei's gauntlet in a burst of light that sent cracks spidering across the chamber's ancient stone floor. For one suspended, breathless moment, either seemed to yield, power straining against power in a standoff that threatened to shatter the temple's remaining structure entirely. Then Chojiro's guard faltered, just slightly, decades of solitary preparation finally proving insufficient against the accumulated weight of bonds Issei had spent weeks building rather than years building alone, and Issei drove forward through the opening, gauntlet fist connecting solidly, sending the older man crashing backward against the temple's raised dais in a spray of broken stone. Silence settled over the chamber, broken only by the ragged sound of both fighters' labored breathing. Chojiro remained slumped against the dais for a long moment before, with visible effort, pushing himself upright, the fourth fragment still clutched loosely in one trembling hand. He studied Issei across the wrecked chamber floor, something unreadable passing behind his exhausted eyes. You fought honestly, he said finally, voice rough. More honestly than I expected, and more honestly, I suspect, than I have fought anything in a very long time. He opened his hand, the fragment resting quiet and dim against his palm, and extended it slowly toward Issei. Take it then. You have earned it, exactly as our terms demanded. Issei crossed the shattered floor carefully, watching for any final trick, and closed his fingers around the fourth fragment, the moment his skin made contact sending a fresh surge of gold light blazing through the shadowed chamber. brighter than anything that had come before, all 4 fragments finally, fully recognizing each other for the first time in 1,000 years. The light built rapidly, pressing outward from Issei's hand in waves that made the ancient pillars themselves seem to hum in sympathetic resonance, and he felt Drake's presence go suddenly, urgently alert inside the gauntlet. It begins now, partner. Hold steady. Whatever comes, hold steady. The world seemed to fall away entirely, the shadow temple chamber dissolving into blinding gold light, and Issei found himself standing, suddenly, somewhere else entirely, a vast, formless space that felt less like a physical location and more like the inside of the crown's own ancient memory, pressing directly against the edges of his consciousness with a weight that made his knees buckle beneath the sheer, overwhelming scale of it. Vessel, a voice said, ancient beyond anything Drake's own 1,000 years could compare to, resonating from everywhere and nowhere at once. 4 fragments gathered. The throne recognizes itself whole again, for the first time since it was broken by those who feared its power more than they trusted its purpose. Now the true question must be answered. Are you strong enough to bear what I am, or merely strong enough to have gathered my pieces? Issei felt the full weight of the crown's presence begin to press inward, vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to his own fragile, mortal limits, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly what Chojiro's warning had meant, exactly what had consumed the 5 failed claimants across 1,000 years of history. This was not a test of strength that could be won through boosted power alone. This was a question the crown itself intended to answer by simply pressing until something, either the vessel or the throne's own patience, finally broke. He thought, desperately, of Tannen's mountain, of the answer that had carried him to that windswept summit. People are counting on me. He reached for that same certainty now, grasping for the memory of Rias's hand steady on his own, Akeno's quiet, unwavering warmth, Kaniko's hard-won trust, Kuroka's unguarded gratitude, Kiba's steady loyalty. The whole vast alliance gathered behind him over 2 determined weeks, and found, beneath the crushing, ancient weight of the crown's full presence, that the bonds held, unbroken, exactly as Drake had promised they would. I am not facing this alone, Issei thought, pushing the certainty outward against the crown's overwhelming pressure with everything he had left. I never have been, not once, not for a single moment, since this all began. Whatever you are, whatever weight you're asking me to carry, I'm not carrying it for myself. I'm carrying it for every single person who chose to stand beside me to get this far. The ancient presence stilled, the crushing weight easing, fractionally at first, then more fully, as though the vast and patient consciousness pressing against Issei's own had, at last, found precisely the answer it had spent 1,000 years of silence waiting to hear. Bonds honestly gathered, the voice said softer now, something that might, in a being this ancient, have passed for satisfaction. That is the answer the 5 who failed could never give, because they never troubled to build it. That is the answer the 7 who survived understood, whether they had words for it or not. You understand it more fully than any claimant I have tested in 1,000 years, vessel. The throne recognizes you. Rise and carry what I am, not as a ruler above 3 warring factions, but as what you have already proven yourself to be, a bridge between people who chose, honestly and without coercion, to stand together. The blinding gold light receded slowly, the vast formless space folding back into the familiar shape of the temple's shattered chamber, and Issei found himself kneeling on the cracked stone floor, gasping, the 4 fragments no longer separate stones but fused seamlessly into a single, small, unassuming pendant resting warm and steady against his palm. The crown mark on the back of his hand settled, finally, into something that felt less like a stirring, unstable power and more like a quiet, permanent part of who he simply was. Rias reached him first, dropping to her knees beside him, hands framing his face with desperate, searching urgency. Issei. Issei, are you? I'm here, he managed, voice rough but steady, meeting her frightened, searching eyes with a small, exhausted smile. I'm okay, Bucho. It's done. The crown's whole again, and I'm still me. The relief that broke across her face was immediate and total, and around them the rest of the gathered alliance closed in, Akeno's hand finding his shoulder, Kaniko and Kuroka pressing close on either side, Kiba's quiet, steady presence anchoring the edge of the small circle, all of them, together, exactly as they had promised to be when the moment finally arrived. Across the shattered chamber, Chojiro watched the scene with an expression that had, somewhere in the past several minutes, shifted from exhausted defeat into something quieter and more complicated, old bitterness settling, slowly, into something that looked almost like grudging, weary acceptance. So, he said softly, into the settling quiet. The crown finally found a vessel worthy enough not to be consumed by it. After 1,000 years of failed claimants, of course it would be a devil's pawn from an unremarkable little town who finally proved worthy, surrounded by people foolish enough to actually care what happened to him. He shook his head slowly, and something that might, in a kinder man, have been the beginning of a genuine smile flickered briefly across his exhausted features. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I am not entirely sorry to have lost tonight. The journey back to Ko passed in the particular, exhausted quiet that followed Rio victory, the whole alliance moving together through the mist-wrapped mountain paths as dawn began, slowly, to break across the eastern sky, gold light spilling over the horizon in a color that felt, to Issei, distinctly and deliberately familiar. Chojiro walked among them under Graphia's watchful escort, subdued but no longer hostile, his fate left for the underworld's careful judgment rather than any hasty decision made in the heat of the temple's shattered chamber. Whatever punishment eventually found him, Issei suspected, would carry less weight than the quiet, complicated defeat already settled behind his tired eyes. You could have simply destroyed him, once the crown recognized you, Kuroka observed, walking close beside Issei with Kaneko at her other side, gold eyes thoughtful. Yeah, a lot of claimants across history probably would have, once they had that kind of power finally settled and steady. I thought about it, Issei admitted honestly. For about half a second, right after everything went quiet again. But it didn't feel right. He fought me honestly, even after decades of being pushed out by the people who should have supported him instead. That's not nothing, even if everything else he did was wrong. Akeno, walking on his other side, hummed thoughtfully. Mercy freely chosen, rather than mercy demanded by circumstance. I think that answers, better than anything the crown itself said to you in that light, exactly what kind of vessel you have already decided to become. Rias, a few steps ahead, glanced back over her shoulder with a small, proud smile that carried more warmth than words could easily manage. The crown chose well, she said simply, and turned back to lead the tired, triumphant procession the rest of the way down the mountain toward home. They reached Ko by mid-morning, the familiar streets and rooftops looking, to Issei's exhausted eyes, somehow both entirely ordinary and quietly, permanently changed, as though the town itself understood, in whatever way towns understood such things, that something significant had finally settled into place. The old school building welcomed them back with its familiar creaking floors and comfortable, sunlit clubroom, and for the first time in weeks, the gathering that settled into its low chairs carried no tension, no urgent maps, no looming confrontations still waiting to be faced. So Azazel said, appearing through the window in his usual fashion, though his grin carried genuine warmth rather than mere irreverence today. Last Dragon Emperor, fully reassembled, and the vessel didn't even need my help for the hard part. I'm almost offended. You helped plenty, Issei said, laughing despite his exhaustion. Aerial recon, sympathizer negotiations, generally terrifying advice about ancient dragon politics. I couldn't have gotten here without any of it. Flattery, Azazel said, though he looked pleased despite himself. I'll take it anyway. He settled into his usual spot against the window, studying Issei with a more serious, assessing look than his usual manner typically allowed. So what happens now, kid? You're carrying a throne that used to sit above gods, devils, and fallen alike. That's not exactly a small thing to simply fold back into ordinary Ko Academy life. Issei considered the question seriously, feeling the small, steady pendant resting warm against his chest beneath his shirt, the crown mark on his hand settled quiet and permanent, no longer flickering or straining, simply, finally, a part of him. I don't think I'm interested in ruling anything, he said finally. I never wanted a throne. I think what I actually want is exactly what got me through all of this in the first place. He looked around the crowded clubroom, at Rias's steady warmth, Akeno's quiet devotion, Kaneko and Kuroka sitting close together in a way that had become entirely natural, Kiba's easy loyalty, and felt something settle fully, contentedly into place in his chest. I want to keep protecting the people who chose to stand with me. That's it. That's the whole plan. If the crown means I'm a little better equipped to do that now, then I'm grateful for it. But it was never really about the crown to begin with. Rias's hand found his beneath the low table, warm and certain, and her smile carried none of the careful composure she usually maintained in front of the wider peerage, only open, unguarded warmth. Then that, she said softly, sounds like exactly the right answer. Outside the clubroom window, morning sunlight spilled fully across the Ko Academy courtyard, warm and golden and entirely ordinary, and Issei found himself, for the first time in what felt like a very long month, simply, quietly grateful, surrounded by people who had chosen, again and again, honestly and without hesitation, to stand beside him, exactly as the ancient crown resting warm against his chest had. In the end, decided mattered more than any throne ever could. A week after the temple, Kuroka finally worked up the nerve to invite the whole peerage to the clan's old holdings for what she insisted on calling, with visible embarrassment, a proper celebration, though Kaneko muttered under her breath the entire walk up the valley path that her sister had never once used the word proper correctly in her life. The valley looked different in full daylight. The mist that had shrouded it during the fight against the purist faction burned away entirely under a clear autumn sky, revealing terraced hillsides in full golden color, and the shrine itself, freshly repaired, standing proud at the valley's center. The two elderly Nikomata who had greeted them weeks before stood waiting at the entrance, alongside a dozen more clan members Issei hadn't met, all of them watching the approaching group with open, curious warmth. "You actually came," Kuroka said, more to herself than anyone else, tail flicking with poorly disguised nerves as the elders approached. "You invited us," Rias pointed out, amused. "Why wouldn't we come?" "I don't know," Kuroka admitted. "Yeah, maybe some part of me still expected an excuse. Old habits." She glanced sideways at Kaneko, who had gone very quiet beside her, studying the gathered clan members with an expression that mixed old wariness with something gentler underneath. The lead elder, the same woman who had bowed to Issei weeks earlier, stepped forward and inclined her head warmly toward the whole group. "Welcome back, Sekirudai. And welcome, Chiron. It has been far too long since you last stood on this ground." Kaneko flinched slightly at the old name, though less sharply than she once might have. "Kaneko," she corrected, though without her usual flat insistence. "But thank you for having us. This will always be your home, whatever name you choose to answer to," the elder said gently. "That was never conditional on anything, child. We only wish you had believed that sooner." The gathering that followed stretched warmly through the afternoon, clan members sharing food and old stories with a peerage that had, only weeks before, been strangers fighting for their lives in this same valley. Issei found himself seated beside one of the older caretakers, listening with genuine fascination to stories of the clan's long history alongside the crown fragment they had guarded, while across the courtyard, Kaneko and Kuroka sat together with several of the younger clan members, Kaneko's careful, guarded posture slowly, visibly easing as the afternoon wore on. "She looks happy," Akeno observed quietly, settling beside Issei with 2 cups of tea, offering him one. "Properly happy. I don't think I have seen that from her before, not like this." "Neither have I," Issei admitted, watching as Kaneko actually laughed at something one of the younger clan members said, an unguarded sound that carried clearly across the courtyard. "I'm glad we came here. I know it wasn't really about the fragment anymore, not for a while now." "No," Akeno agreed. "I think it stopped being about the fragment the moment Kuroka chose to ask for her sister's help instead of simply taking what she needed and leaving again." She sipped her tea thoughtfully, watching the scene with quiet contentment. Sometimes the most important things a crisis uncovers have very little to do with the crisis itself. Later, as the afternoon began to fade toward evening, Kuroka found Issei alone near the shrine's outer edge, watching the valley settle into golden dusk. She settled beside him without her usual playful energy, something quieter and more sincere in her posture instead. "I wanted to actually thank you," she said. "Properly, I mean, not just the teasing version I usually manage." Whatever happens with the crown, whatever it ends up meaning for the wider world, you gave me my sister back. That's worth more to me than any fragment ever was. I didn't really do that, Issei said. You two did that yourselves. I just gave you a reason to finally try. Maybe, Kuroka said, gold eyes reflecting the fading light. But sometimes people need a reason before they're brave enough to try something they've wanted for a long time anyway. She bumped her shoulder lightly against his, some of her usual playfulness returning to her smile. Yeah, for what it's worth, Dragon Boy, I think you make a pretty good reason. Don't let it go to your head. Wouldn't dream of it, Issei said, laughing, and the two of them sat together in comfortable silence as the last light faded fully from the valley, the shrine behind them settling into peaceful evening quiet, its long guardianship finally, fully complete. The following weekend, with the crown fully settled and the aftermath of Chojiro's defeat handled quietly through underworld channels, Rias found Issei alone on the clubroom balcony after evening training, watching the sunset paint the cool rooftops in warm amber light. You've been thoughtful today, she observed, joining him at the railing. Just thinking about everything that's happened, Issei admitted. A month ago I was just trying to survive stray devil fights without embarrassing myself in front of you. Now I'm apparently carrying an ancient throne around in a pendant under my shirt. He shook his head slightly, still faintly disbelieving of the whole strange journey. It doesn't feel real sometimes, even now. It's real, Rias said softly, her hand finding his on the railing. All of it. The fragments, the trials, the crown recognizing you as worthy. But I don't think that's actually what's been on your mind today, is it? Issei glanced at her, faintly surprised, though he supposed he shouldn't have been. Rias had always seen through him more easily than he expected. No, he admitted. I've just been thinking about how much everyone did for me this past month. You, Akeno, Kaneko and Kuroka. Even Sona and Azazel and Grafia, people who didn't have to get involved at all. He met her eyes, something warm and a little nervous settling into his chest. I don't think I ever properly told you how much that meant. How much you mean, honestly, this whole time. Rias's expression softened into something unguarded and genuine, crimson eyes bright in the fading evening light. You don't need to tell me, Issei. I've watched you prove it, every single day since that first flare of gold light in the courtyard. That has always mattered more to me than words could. She stepped closer, her free hand coming up to rest gently against his chest, directly over where the pendant now rested warm and quiet beneath his shirt. But I am glad to hear you say it anyway. They stood together for a long, comfortable moment, the last light of evening settling gold and warm across the courtyard below, the quiet, hard-won peace of the past week finally, fully allowed to simply be enjoyed rather than braced against the next crisis. For what it's worth, Issei said eventually, whatever the crown turns out to mean for the wider world, for the factions, for all of it. I already know what actually matters most to me about carrying it. And what's that? Rias asked, though something in her soft smile suggested she already suspected the answer. You, Issei said simply. All of you. Everyone who chose to stand with me when it counted. The crown's just. It's just the reason I got to find that out so clearly. I think I'd have been grateful for the people either way, honestly, crown or no crown. Rias's answering smile was the warmest he had seen from her yet, and she leaned into him slightly, resting her head against his shoulder, as the evening settled fully into dusk around them. Then perhaps, she said softly, that old, patient crown did more good reassembling itself in your hands than anyone across 1,000 years of scattered history ever expected it to. Below them, the courtyard settled into peaceful evening quiet, and somewhere inside the old school building, the sound of Akeno's gentle laughter carried faintly on the breeze, mingling with Kaneko's quieter voice and Kuroka's playful teasing, the whole strange, hard-won family the past month had built together simply existing, for once, without urgency or crisis, in the warm and settled aftermath of everything they had faced to get here. Autumn deepened over Ko in the weeks that followed, ordinary life slowly, gently reclaiming its familiar rhythms even as the extraordinary settled quietly alongside it. Classes resumed their usual routine. Matsuda and Motohama continued their usual grievances, still blissfully unaware of exactly how much their friend's life had changed over the past month, and Issei found, to his own quiet relief, that he did not mind the ordinary at all anymore, having spent enough time chasing the extraordinary to properly appreciate what waited on the other side of it. The pendant remained a constant, quiet presence beneath his shirt, no longer straining or unstable, simply a settled part of who he had become, the crown mark on his hand visible only when he deliberately summoned it, otherwise resting dormant and peaceful beneath ordinary skin. Word of the crown's reassembly had, as expected, traveled through the wider factions in the weeks since, careful diplomatic conversations beginning slowly between the underworld, the Gremory, and the handful of yokai elders who still remembered the old stories, none of them entirely certain yet what a whole dragon emperor bloodline settled into a young devil's pawn actually meant for the delicate balance between factions. Though Rias had made abundantly, formally clear that Issei had no interest in disrupting that balance, only in protecting what he already valued. Azazel visited occasionally, usually uninvited, usually through the window, delivering updates on the careful diplomatic conversations with his characteristic mix of irreverence and genuine investment in the outcome. Chojiro, Issei learned during one such visit, had been placed under quiet, watchful custody rather than harsher punishment, the underworld's judgment tempered, in no small part, by a certain young Sekiryudi's own testimony about the honesty of their final confrontation. "You're a soft touch, you know that," Azazel said during one particularly lazy afternoon visit, sprawled comfortably against the clubroom window frame. Most vessels who finally gathered a crown like that would have wanted their defeated rival to suffer a lot more than quiet custody. "Maybe," Issei said, shrugging. "But I don't think making him suffer more would have actually fixed anything. He already lost the thing he spent decades chasing." "Seemed like enough." "Soft touch," Azazel repeated, though his grin carried clear approval rather than mockery. "Good thing, too, probably. A crown that used to sit above three warring factions probably needed a softer hand eventually, after everything it's already survived." The clan elders sent word occasionally as well, small updates on the valley's slow, quiet recovery, and Kaneko had taken, in the weeks since the celebration there, to visiting more regularly, sometimes bringing Kuroka along, sometimes going alone, the careful, mending relationship between the two sisters continuing to grow steadier with each visit, old wounds slowly, patiently healing in a way that no single conversation could have accomplished alone. On a quiet evening near the end of the month, the whole peerage gathered in the clubroom for what had become, without anyone quite deciding it deliberately, a regular tradition, tea and easy conversation after the day's training concluded, no urgent crisis demanding their attention, simply the comfortable, hard-won peace of people who had chosen, again and again, to stand together. "You know," Kiba observed, settled comfortably near the window with his own cup of tea, "a month ago none of us would have believed we'd end up here. A reassembled ancient crown, amended Nekishu family, half the underworld and the Gremory suddenly invested in Issei's well-being. It's been quite a month." "Quite a month," Rias agreed, smiling warmly at the assembled group, her gaze settling last, and longest, on Issei, seated beside her with the quiet, settled contentment that had become his own new, ordinary normal. "Though I find I'm rather grateful for exactly how it turned out." Issei looked around the crowded, familiar clubroom, at Akeno's warm, patient smile, Kaneko's quiet, unguarded happiness, Kuroka's playful energy tempered now with genuine belonging, Kiba's easy loyalty, and felt the pendant beneath his shirt settle warm and steady against his chest, a 1,000-year-old crown finally, fully at peace, resting quietly alongside a family that had chosen, honestly and without hesitation, to become exactly what it needed to be. "Me too," he said simply, and meant it more fully than any words could properly carry. Whatever the crown turned out to mean for the wider world in the months and years still to come, he understood now, with a certainty that felt as settled and permanent as the mark on his own hand, that he had already found the answer to the only question that had actually mattered from the very beginning. He was not carrying any of it alone, and he never would again. Graphia's visit came without warning on the first properly cold evening of the season, snow dusting the rooftops for the first time that year, and she found Rias and Issei together in the clubroom, poring over ordinary school assignments with the particular domestic ease that had become their new, comfortable normal. "I apologize for the interruption," Graphia said, though her tone suggested the apology was mostly formality. Surzex asked me to deliver something in person, given its significance. Rias set down her pen immediately, old instincts sharpening at her sister-in-law's careful phrasing. What is it? Grafia produced a small, sealed scroll, offering it to Issei rather than Rias, a deliberate choice that did not go unnoticed. Formal correspondence from the underworld's ruling council, along with representatives from the Gremory and, remarkably, a delegation of yokai elders willing to speak with a unified voice for the first time in centuries. They wished to formally recognize the last Dragon Emperor's reassembly, and to establish, with your consent, an ongoing council specifically to manage the diplomatic questions a whole crown inevitably raises among the factions. Issei accepted the scroll carefully, turning it over in his hands with visible unease. That sounds like a lot more responsibility than I was expecting to sign up for. It is, Grafia agreed evenly. Which is precisely why the offer includes the option to decline, or to accept only partial involvement, whatever balance you feel comfortable maintaining between this new responsibility and the ordinary life you have clearly worked hard to preserve alongside it. Surzex was quite insistent that this remain your choice, freely made, rather than an obligation quietly forced upon you by factions eager to claim some stake in your bloodline now that it has proven stable. Rias's hand found Issei's beneath the table, steady and grounding. Whatever you decide, she said quietly, I'll support it completely. Issei turned the scroll over once more, considering the weight of what it represented, the careful, hard-won piece of the past month balanced now against a wider world clearly eager to understand what a whole Dragon Emperor bloodline meant for the delicate balance between factions. He thought of Chojiro's decades of solitary, bitter preparation, of the 5 failed claimants across history who had gathered the crown for themselves alone, of the 7 who had survived it precisely because they understood, as he had finally understood atop that ancient stone dais, that power meant nothing divorced from the bonds that gave it purpose. I'll accept, he said finally, but only if it works the way Drake's history lesson taught me it should. Not me deciding things alone from some council chamber. All of us, together, the same way we handled everything else this past month. He looked up at Grafia, something steady and certain settling into his expression. If the factions want my voice on questions like this, they get all of you too. Rias. Akeno. Everyone who actually helped me earn the right to have that voice in the first place. Grafia studied him for a long moment, something that might, on her carefully composed features, have been genuine approval flickering briefly to the surface. I will relay that condition precisely, she said. I suspect my husband will find it entirely unsurprising, and entirely fitting. She departed shortly after, leaving the scroll resting on the low table between them, snow continuing to drift gently past the clubroom window, and Rias leaned into Issei's shoulder with a soft, contented sigh. A council seat, she said, faintly amused. I don't think either of us expected that particular outcome, a month ago. I don't think either of us expected any of it, a month ago, Issei said, laughing softly. But I think I'm finally getting used to my life being a lot stranger than I planned for. Good, Rias said. Because I don't think it's going to get any less strange from here. She glanced up at him, warmth and quiet excitement mingling in her expression despite the daunting scope of what the scroll represented. But I find, rather to my own surprise, that I'm looking forward to facing whatever comes next, exactly as strange as it turns out to be. Outside, the snow continued its slow, gentle descent over Ko, softening the familiar rooftops into something quietly beautiful, and Issei found himself watching it fall alongside Rias in the warm, settled quiet of the clubroom, more content than he had been in longer than he could easily remember. The crown was whole. The bonds that had carried him through gathering it remained steady and unshaken. And whatever the wider world still had waiting for him, whatever new questions a formal council seat and a stabilized ancient bloodline would inevitably raise in the months and years ahead, he understood now, with a certainty that had settled as permanently into him as the mark on his own hand, that he would face every bit of it exactly the way he had faced the crown's final trial, surrounded by people who had chosen, honestly and without hesitation, to stand beside him, for as long as any of them cared to keep choosing it. The snow kept falling, soft and quiet over the sleeping town, and somewhere beneath it, a 1,000-year-old throne rested warm and settled against the young dragon's heart, finally, fully at peace. Akeno found Issei alone in the shrine courtyard a few days later, having offered to accompany him on a visit to thank her grandmother properly now that the whole ordeal had settled into peaceful resolution, the old woman having retreated inside to prepare tea and leaving the two of them alone beneath the ancient cedar trees. She seems pleased, Issei said, watching the shrine's sliding door close behind Akeno's grandmother. About how everything turned out, I mean. She is, Akeno said, settling onto the stone steps beside him, the autumn afternoon light filtering gold through the cedar branches overhead. Her family guarded a fragment of that crown for 1,000 years without ever knowing what it truly meant, trusting only that the duty itself mattered. To see it finally answered, and answered well, means more to her than she would easily admit aloud. Issei nodded, comfortable silence settling between them for a long moment before he glanced sideways at her, something he had been turning over for days finally finding its way toward words. Akeno, I wanted to say something, actually. About the shrine, and everything that happened after. Oh? She tilted her head, curious warmth in her violet eyes. You were the one who first recognized the crown mark, Issei said. Before Azazel, before the warden even explained anything properly. You knew, somehow, that it mattered, and you brought me here without hesitation, even though neither of us really understood what we were walking into. He met her gaze, something earnest and slightly nervous settling into his expression despite his best efforts to sound steady. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for that. For trusting the mark meant something worth investigating, and for trusting me enough to bring me here to find out. Akeno's smile softened into something quieter and more private than her usual teasing warmth, the kind of expression Issei had come, over the past strange month, to recognize as entirely genuine rather than performed for effect. You do not need to thank me for that, Issei. I would have brought you here regardless of what the mark turned out to mean, simply because you asked, and because I wanted to help however I could. She looked out over the quiet courtyard, autumn leaves drifting slowly down around the ancient stone lanterns. Though I confess, if I am being honest, some part of me is glad it turned out to matter as much as it did. It gave me a reason to be useful to you in a way I might not have found otherwise. You're always useful to me, Issei said, then immediately winced at how that sounded. That came out wrong. I mean, you're not just useful, you matter. A lot. Not just because of the shrine or the mark, or any of it. Akeno's soft laugh carried genuine delight rather than teasing, and she reached over to rest her hand gently over his, the same gesture she had offered weeks before in the clubroom, though it carried a steadier, more settled warmth now than it had that first tense evening. I know what you meant, Issei. And for what it is worth, you matter to me the same way. Not because of the crown, or the mark, or anything the wider factions now believe you represent. Simply because of who you have proven yourself to be, across this entire strange and difficult month. They sat together in comfortable quiet for a while longer, the afternoon light shifting slowly through the cedar branches, the shrine settling into peaceful, ordinary calm around them, its long guardianship finally, fully complete, and its purpose honored exactly as generations of careful, patient watching had always hoped it might be. Can I ask you something? Issei said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. Of course. Rias and I have been. Well, you've probably noticed things have gotten more serious there, Issei said, feeling his face warm slightly despite himself. And I care about you too, just as much, honestly. I don't really know how any of this is supposed to work, with everything else going on, but I didn't want you to think that meant less room for this. For us. Akeno considered the question for a long, thoughtful moment, her expression settling into something calm and unhurried, entirely free of the jealousy or hesitation Issei had half feared might color her response. I have never needed you to choose, Issei, she said finally. Rias is my closest friend, and has been since we were children with far fewer people willing to stand beside either of us. Watching the two of you grow close has never felt like losing something. If anything, it has felt like watching something I already cared about deeply become even more solid, even more worth protecting. She squeezed his hand gently. There is room enough in this for all of us to matter, exactly as much as we choose to. I am not worried about that, and I do not think you should be either. Relief and warmth mingled openly across Issei's face, and he found himself laughing softly, some of the nervous tension he had been carrying for days finally easing loose. I really did get lucky, didn't I? With all of you, I mean. Extraordinarily lucky, Akeno agreed, amusement returning fully to her voice, though the warmth beneath it remained entirely genuine. Though I suspect, if you asked any of us honestly, we would each say the same thing about you. She rose, offering him a hand to help him up from the stone steps, autumn light catching gold in her dark hair. Now come. My grandmother will have tea ready, and I believe she has been looking forward to properly thanking you herself, in whatever gruff, roundabout manner she manages such things. Issei took her offered hand, rising to join her, and together they made their way back toward the shrine's main hall, the ancient cedar trees swaying gently overhead in the crisp autumn breeze, the crown resting quiet and settled beneath his shirt, and something equally settled, equally certain, warming steadily in his chest as he walked beside her through the quiet, golden afternoon. Later that evening, walking back down the long stone staircase together, as the last light faded fully from the sky, Issei found himself thinking, not for the first time since the temple's shattered chamber had settled quiet around him, how strange and fortunate the whole strange month had been, beginning with fear in a courtyard shadowed by a collapsing stray devil's husk and ending here, on familiar stone steps worn smooth by generations of careful footsteps, walking beside someone who had chosen, from that very first uncertain night, to trust that whatever the crown turned out to mean, it was worth investigating honestly, together, rather than alone. Penny for your thoughts, Akeno said, glancing sideways at him as they reached the bottom of the staircase. Just thinking about how much has changed, Issei admitted. A month ago I didn't even know this shrine existed. Now I don't think I could imagine my life without it, or without your grandmother's tea, or any of the people who ended up standing with me because of what happened here. Change has a way of surprising us with exactly what it turns out to be worth, Akeno said softly, threading her fingers through his as they continued down the quiet, lantern-lit path toward town. I find I am rather grateful for this particular change, whatever strange and demanding month it took to arrive at it. Me too, Issei said, and meant it fully, the crown resting warm and settled beneath his shirt, the whole hard-won family of the past month walking, in one way or another, alongside him still, into whatever quietly extraordinary future waited patiently ahead. Winter arrived properly over Ko in the weeks that followed, the first true snowfall blanketing the academy grounds in soft white quiet, and on a particularly still evening, the whole peerage gathered once more in the familiar clubroom, tea steaming gently in their hands, no crisis looming, no ancient warden waiting in the shadows, only the comfortable, ordinary warmth of people who had chosen, again and again, to remain exactly where they were. Rias watched the snow drift past the window, her hand resting easily in Issei's, and allowed herself, for the first time in what felt like a very long season, to simply enjoy the quiet without bracing for whatever might come to disturb it. 1,000 years, she said softly, half to herself. 1,000 years that crown waited, scattered and silent, for someone worth trusting with all of it again. And it got you instead, Kuroka added from her spot beside Kaneko, grinning despite the teasing warmth in her voice. Yeah, the ancient powers really do have a sense of humor. I'll take that as a compliment, Issei said, laughing, and looked around the small, familiar room at every face that had, over one extraordinary month, become simply and permanently home. Whatever the wider world still had waiting beyond these walls, whatever new questions a whole Dragon Emperor bloodline would continue to raise among the careful, watchful factions, he understood now, fully and finally, that he would face all of it exactly as he had faced everything else. Together, and without fear, surrounded by the people who had chosen, honestly and completely, to stay. Outside, the snow kept falling over the sleeping town, soft and endless and quietly beautiful, and somewhere beneath the old-school building's warm lantern light, 1,000-year-old crown rested finally, fully at peace, exactly where it had always truly belonged. Issei fell asleep that night thinking of mountains climbed and fragments gathered, of old grudges mended and new ones gently forgiven, of a crown 1,000 years silent finally choosing, freely and without coercion, exactly who it wished to trust with everything it had once represented. He did not dream of thrones or wars or ancient wardens at all that night. He dreamed, simply and contentedly, of the ordinary, extraordinary family that had gathered around him to make certain he never had to carry any of it alone. Thanks for listening.